Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the February 16th, 2016 meeting of the Los Gatos Town Council. I will ask you all to please silence your devices and ask the clerk to call the roll.
Good evening. Councilmember Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Councilmember Rob Rennie.
Here.
Councilmember Steve Leonardis.
Here.
Vice Mayor Mariko Sayak.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Barbara Spector.
Here. At this point, I would ask you all to rise and join me in the salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Do we have a closed session report, Mr. Town Attorney?
Yes. Prior to tonight's regular session, councilmen in closed session to discuss labor negotiations with the various unions for the town. No action was taken and requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is called Small Business Big Applause. It is the opportunity for me as mayor to commend a business in our town that has served us well and for a long time. The commendation is there in front, so I will be going down there to share it with you. The business we are honoring this evening, I'm sure almost everyone in this room has gone into their doors. I'm also sure that you were served well by them and that they knew exactly where everything was that you were asking for. Ta-da! That business is Rural Supply Hardware. Now, what you may know or may not know, I did not, is that they have been in business in Los Gatos since 1944. The Nelson family has owned and operated the business since the 1960s. Now, I'm going to ask if are Ken and Tim Nelson here in the audience? Okay, come on up. Come on around here. Just Ken. Okay. Well, on behalf of the town of Los Gatos and all of its council members, we want to thank you, your family, for everything you have done for our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to say a few words?
Just a very hearty thank you. And just one point of clarification, in between the original family and us was the Johnson family as well, from the 60s through the 80s. So you bet, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
You bet.
Not only do they run a great business, but when you go in there and you want some, little screwdriver or screw or a handle, they not only have it, but they know exactly where it is. And the owners are the ones that take you to the correct aisle, to the correct portion of that aisle. So that is just wonderful. Thanks again. At this point on our agenda, we have council matters, and I will start with Ms. Jensen.
Thank you. This past Thursday, I attended 2 different meetings dealing with transportation issues in the Santa Clara Valley, basically connected with the proposed sales tax measure to be on the ballot in November. And there was a discussion of potential allocation of funding, how money would be spent if the measure were passed. And they were conducted by a Silicon Valley Leadership Group that included elected officials in the North and West counties and business leaders. And the second meeting was a Santa Clara County Mayor's meeting, which touched on exactly the same issues.
Thank you. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have 3 items. Last Wednesday, the 10th, I attended the ABAG Legislative Workshop in Sacramento, where we listened to many speakers from the Assembly and the Senate, which included Rich Gordon, who used to include our district here, and another Assembly Speaker, Atkins. Generally, the themes were about budget, transportation, affordable housing, and one person was talking about disaster relief and resilience. On Thursday last week, I attended the VTA PAC Policy Advisory Committee, where they reported on their successful Super Bowl transportation without any glitches. We also heard from Sunnyvale about their land use and transportation element. There was discussion of Senate Bill 743, or mention of it anyway, that passed in 2013. They're now starting to get ready to implement, and the significance of that is that the changing of the LOS, or the auto level of service, toward they're probably going to go towards total vehicle miles instead of the wait time at lights. They also talked about light rail enhancement projects that they're thinking of doing that would be targeting reducing transit times. The other thing I attended last Thursday on the 11th also was the Cities Association meeting. We heard from San Jose Mayor Liccardo on a presentation about a minimum wage study that he's spearheading and will share with all of us. Also, we had a presentation by Yellow Cab Company asking us for consistent regulation across cities so that they can better compete with Uber and the other new TNCs, I guess they call them. Because there's such a patchwork of regulations for them, it's more costly. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. I attended the reception for art in the council chambers for the artwork that you see on the walls around us. That was the work of the artist at the Los Gatos High School. I attended the Los Gatos Union School District Summit, which was a day-long summit where the school district was brainstorming on how best to proceed. There was a regional transportation meeting in Mountain View, which generally covered the same topics as was previously mentioned, and I attended along with our town manager, Laura Pravetti. Mr. Rennie and I had a parking infrastructure ad hoc committee meeting, and for the council members here, we made the decision to now send the idea up to the council. We are making recommendations, and we are now we'll be looking for your input. I was one of the judges at the Student Speakers Contest at the Lions Club. And there was also a meeting of the CDAC Advisory Committee where we gave input on a potential gymnasium, for lack of a better term, off of Blossom Hill, and also a four condominiums on Roberts Road. Ms. Sayak.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In addition to the CDAC meeting in the Los Gatos Union School District Summit, I also attended on behalf of the council the library's 4th anniversary, which just occurred last Thursday, and we introduced our new poet laureate. And I also attended the Vision Zero informational night that was sponsored by the Los Gatos Union School District. In terms of for the council's benefit, the discussion was really making it a goal, and the goal of Vision Zero is to have no further fatalities on the road, whether you're pedestrian, bicyclist, or driving a car, and that each community then decides the priorities and goals to reach that vision.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I also attended the school district summit meeting, and I attended with the Vice Mayor the Citizens Ad Hoc Committee meeting, and I attended the West Valley Solid Waste Management Authority meeting on February 4th, where we elected a new chair and vice chair. And I attended the West Valley Sanitation District meeting where we handled mostly a closed session item that I'm not at liberty to speak about. And last but not least, I attended the Treatment Plan Advisory Committee in San Jose, and that was a general business meeting.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is the manager matters.
Thank you, Mayor. Just two quick items. We are continuing to recruit for boards and commissions. In particular, we have openings on our Arts and Culture Commission, our General Plan Committee, and our Transportation and Parking Commission. We have extended the application deadline, and you can get the application on the clerk's website. In addition, the town will be hosting an open house for the North 40 Phase 1 project on February 23rd in these chambers at 6 p.m., and we invite the public to see a scale model of the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now on to our consent items, which this evening consist of agenda items 1 through 6. These items will be acted upon in one motion unless someone from the council or the audience pulls an item from the consent calendar. First, look to the council. Anyone want to pull an item? See no one. I don't have a card, but does anyone from the audience wish to pull an item from the consent calendar? See no one, may I have a motion? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
A motion and a second. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. We are now on to verbal communications. I don't have a card, but if anybody wishes to address us on an item that is not on our agenda, please come forward. You'll have 3 minutes. I don't have a card, and no one is coming forward. All right, we are now on to other business, starting with agenda item 7, PPW job number 13-31. Almond Grove Street Rehabilitation Project, 411-811-003. We will have a staff report. I do have several cards on this. If you wish to speak, please give your card to staff over to my left. Ms. Peterson.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Lisa Peterson, Town Engineer. It's good to be here tonight to discuss this milestone in the Almond Grove Street Rehabilitation Project, where we have actual bid results for a reconstruction in concrete and in asphalt for Broadway and Bachman. There is a lot of background on the Almond Grove Street Rehabilitation Project. We have done a lot of community outreach. We have had 6 community meetings. We have an Almond Grove webpage. We have an Almond Grove email list we sent updates to. We've had a poll in the community asking them their preference between concrete and asphalt. We also have been in front of council in the last 2 years about 6 times. This will be the 7th. When we were in front of council in fall of 2015, council at that point did ask us to revise the plans for Broadway and Bachman, putting the curb back into the location it currently exists out there, additionally trying to save as much sidewalk as possible while still meeting ADA requirements, and additionally to make sure any tree removals were meeting the revised sections of Section 26 of the town code on trees, and we believe we have met that. Now, before I get into a project discussion, I did want to highlight a couple general project elements, and I'll put something up on the overhead here. So again, I did want to discuss with council the difference between a construction bid and a request for proposals. So with a construction bid, we have a set time and date when those bids are opened publicly. When those bids are opened publicly, the Public Contracts Code does require us to award to the low bidder. When we have a request for proposals and those proposals are brought in and reviewed, the California Government Code requires us to award that to the most qualified consultant. Now, we can use an element of cost to review that, but it cannot be the overriding reason. It needs to be qualification-based. Previously, I had also showed Council this chart on project cost estimating, and I just wanted to remind Council of this. Again, with estimating, we are giving our best guesstimate based on the information we have on what the bids will come in at. So for Broadway and Bachman now, we have actual bids. So we know as we move forward into those projects what those costs will be. So the council did direct us to bid Broadway and Bachman, both for a reconstruction in asphalt and a reconstruction in concrete. When those bids were opened on February 1st, we had 7 bids for the asphalt reconstruction, and the low bid came from Redgwick Construction for an amount of $1,978,633. When the concrete bids were opened publicly, we had a total of 6 bids, and the low bid came from Vanguard Construction, and that bid was for $2,388,621. And council may award to the low bidder of either the asphalt reconstruction or the concrete reconstruction. But per the Public Contracts Code, council cannot, for example, if you liked the traffic control bid item and the curb and gutter bid item better with another contractor, or perhaps you just thought a different contractor was going to do a better job out there. Public Contracts Code does not allow us to jump over the low bidder and go to a different contractor. So we do have to award to the low bidder. In the memo that you have tonight, it does provide an estimate for all 10 streets, both in concrete reconstruction and in asphalt reconstruction. That total cost does provide cost also for the design and also for construction management. The way that we came up with that is we took the costs that we got for Broadway and Bachman, and we extrapolated them across all of the remaining streets. And as we had mentioned previously to council, for 7 of those streets, there has been no more design done except the conceptual design that was done in 2011. So based on the best information we have today, we have come up with those estimates, and we have shown total reconstruction for all the streets and asphalt being approximately $14.1 million, and for concrete being $16.7 million. And I did want to put up an overhead on our budget. So I did just want to remind council that council did put $12.2 million in an Almond Grove Reserve Fund last October. Additionally, council put $2.1 million of capital projects on hold. Now, council also requested us last fall to provide a life maintenance cost regarding asphalt maintenance and concrete maintenance, which we have provided an attachment for of your council memo. We did collaborate with the town finance department, town manager's office on coming up with that information. And I did want to mention that, previously when these costs were shown to council, they were shown as future costs. What we have done is put them in present day costs. And if you review that attachment 4, what you see is when you're looking at asphalt maintenance and concrete maintenance over a 50-year period of time, bringing it into today's dollars and also including construction costs, that asphalt maintenance is approximately $1.3 million more than maintenance of concrete. Now, it is important to note that we have made some assumptions in getting these numbers, such as what the inflation rate will be. So we've said the inflation rate will be 3%. We've said we'll have a 1% interest. One of the things that we do say in that attachment 4 is that these costs are difficult to predict. And the reason they're difficult to predict is we're projecting out 50 years, and some of those assumptions could change. So, for example, we could have a different inflation rate, or there could be a different maintenance program that the town takes up, or one of the material prices could change drastically, or labor prices. But again, based on the information that we have today, this is our best estimate of what we believe those costs will be. Also in your council memo, there is a chart that shows the pros and cons of asphalt pavement and concrete pavement. We have discussed this with council in the past. This is in your report for your review. We have also made a recommendation for a 5-year no-cut rule on any newly constructed streets in the Almond Grove neighborhood, and also some recommendations on those replacement practices should those streets happen to be cut for emergency utility repair or some other reason. We have also provided a schedule in your memo. That schedule does show if council does award one of these projects tonight, either a reconstruction for asphalt or a reconstruction for concrete, we would anticipate being in construction by the middle of May and ultimately, barring any delays, be completed with the project October, November timeframe. Now, if council does not award a project tonight, we believe that the construction would probably get pushed into the winter months, possibly into spring 2017. And it is important to note that the bids are valid through the end of March 2016. Thank you very much. That's the end of my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Question of staff. Ms. Jensen.
I'm not sure if this is for you, Ms. Peterson, or somebody else. It has to do with the desk item that we got tonight that answers various questions. I'm not sure what it's titled, but it is responding to questions received, I'm assuming, from council. And what I'm interested in is the second page talks about the Almond Grove Reserve. And my question is, I want to just test an assumption that I'm making, which may be incorrect. If the council were to opt for asphalt, which is less expensive, and save X amount of dollars, do those savings become available for expenditure however the council may choose in the general fund? Or do they go back to capital improvements? Or do they just go back to the Almond Grove Reserve? So all I've done is put more money in the Almond Grove Reserve pot.
And I would defer that to the town manager's office for response.
So there is just council discretion. You have established by resolution an Almond Grove Reserve of $12.2 million. If we find that we do not need all of those funds, the council has the option of closing down that reserve if we've allocated all of it, and any additional funds could either go towards the maintenance of those streets, or council would have the discretion to implement it back into the capital program or for operating.
Follow up?
Ms. Jensen.
Just so I make sure I understand, that if the council were to decide, for example, to use asphalt, thereby saving $440,000, that $440,000 does not now become available for the town to use other than to stick back in the pot for future use on Almond Grove?
Again, it depends on how the council would like to handle this particular item. You have the discretion. If you've used up the $12.2 million, then
okay. Bear with me. But I haven't used the $12.2 million because you're asking me to spend 2 point whatever or 1 point whatever. So I'm not going to use the $12.2 million. So if the council were to vote for the less expensive option, that money doesn't become available for use in the town. It just goes right back to the same fund,
right,
unless there's a separate action by the council to re-examine the allocation of that money.
That's correct. It would take a separate action.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. So if this $12.2 million is in this fund and it is not all being used at one time, is that fund bearing any interest for the town?
The reserve money does sit in our treasury account, and we earn about 1%, a little less than that in interest. So we will continue to earn interest. It's a really reduced rate, and that's why we tried to capture net present value when we were looking at lifetime maintenance. And that's the amount of money today we would need to maintain and do the project over the next 50 years.
Mr. Leonardis.
Follow-up question. So it's in this particular account, it's earning a certain amount of interest, and if it were in one of the other reserve accounts that it had come from, would it also be earning the same amount of interest?
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me ask you sort of a question along the lines of Ms. Jensen's. I'm looking at the staff report and page 3, and it shows $12 million that on a reserve account established last year, then it shows a $2 million on hold. So I'm going to simplistically say we have $14 million there, but your staff report indicates that, for example, concrete is, for all the streets, is $16 million. So if we had these monies to contribute toward the concrete, we would still be $2 million short under these numbers and these assumptions.
Correct.
Okay. Other questions? Seeing no one, I do have several cards, and anyone wishing to address us should be submitting a card to staff. First one, John Hammett. All right, Mary Ellen Kashub.
It's brief, but living in Almond Grove, it's really frustrating. And so much is asked of our neighborhood for this town, whether it's carriage rides or it's the bike race, it's the Halloween, it's Christmas parade. Now it's Waze sending people through our neighborhood for the beach, and we started to see that again this weekend. I just would love to see a schedule for all our streets. I know you have it for 2 streets, but the rest of them are crumbling. Our sidewalks are crumbling. Our curbs are crumbling. I would like to see a general master plan budgeted so that we know going forward what we can expect in this town. I really would like to see it. So I ask you, please, to do that. Thank you.
Let me have a question for you. You're not going to get away that easy.
Okay.
We have an agenda item 7 that establishes a process for 2 of the streets, Bachman and Broadway.
Right.
We have an agenda item 8 that starts the process, that proposes to start the process for the other streets. Is it your suggestion or request that we hold everything back at this juncture?
No, I would like to see a schedule. I mean, you're committed to Broadway and Bachman. I mean, that has been all the way through it, those 2 streets. Whether I agree with that or not, you all have that on your docket. What I'm asking for is the rest of our streets you have a budget, that they be considered, and it's not just those 2 streets.
Thank you.
That help?
Oh, wait a minute, Mr. Leonardis.
Yep.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Do you think a better approach might be to have all 10 streets bid at one time by one contractor?
I don't know enough what's involved, but if that's the best way to go, and then it's scheduled out over the next 2 years or whatever, that would be great. But I don't want to wait another 15 years, 10 years, 20 years was the first estimate on it. And we're in the first block of Masal, and we get trucks, we get landscape, we get everything. And the street continues to break down. So we'd like some hope and a plan.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Lynn Brandhorst.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and council members. You've seen me here before. First of all, I want to once again thank Matt Morley and Lisa Peterson and their staffs for all the work that's gone into this agenda item. I'd also like to thank those who worked on the financial and budget side to assure that the entire Almond Grove Street reconstruction project is feasible and practical. Hopefully, no one still feels their street might be left out, though I can see that that's not universally true. I've been looking forward to being here this evening. I haven't always been able to say that for some previous meetings, because I believe you have an easy decision to make tonight, and I have confidence it'll be the right decision. You already know how strongly Broadway neighborhood feels about the importance of our historic concrete street, and I think the vast majority of Almond Grove residents feel the same about their neighborhood. but I want you to make the right decision tonight for all the right reasons. It's not just about Broadway, and it's not just about the Almond Grove neighborhood. It's the right decision to retain and maintain the historic concrete streets for the town of Los Gatos. It's our history, but also our future. Please make this decision in the best interests of Los Gatos, for everyone's children and grandchildren, and all of us who love living in downtown Los Gatos in years to come, and visitors and downtown merchants in Los Gatos. Keep this important part of our legacy into the future. Thank you for your time, your efforts, and your own love for Los Gatos that led you to be seated here today. It's almost time to celebrate this victory for Los Gatos and move on to other important issues that we care about because we live here and love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you, sir. Clay Slocum.
Good evening, Mayor and Town Councilman. My name is Clay Slocum. I'm with the California-Nevada Cement Association, which is a nonprofit trade association representing the concrete pavement option. I stand in front of you today as a technical resource. I would also like to point out that I have really high hopes for the Almond Grove neighborhood. The low bidder on the concrete has already reached out to me, and I have high hopes of working with the town in the future, as the contractor is already pointing out different areas where they think they can value engineer and save the town significant savings on the project. And so I look forward to potentially reaching out and working with the town, the council, and the contractor moving forward. And I make myself available to the public if there are future concrete pavement needs or maintenance questions or anything of the sorts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Slocum, do you think it would be more advantageous to pave 10 streets at one time or 2 streets on a separate bid and then come back a couple of years later and pave 8 more streets potentially?
I think my personal opinion is that experience would dictate that your traffic control and having it all go to one project would decrease several of the line item costs just based on not having to mobilize multiple times. Whether or not it's significant is hard to tell. I also know that it depends on what year you do this project in. Costs are anticipated to go up for both materials in the near future, so it could go either way, I would say, but it could be a cost savings, kind of the Costco effect, I would say, of bulk. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dennis Grist.
Dennis Grist, 215 Tate. I have spoken and written to you about this stuff before, so I'll just be brief. The Almond Grove historical zone, the historical committee recommends concrete as a historical aspect of the neighborhood. I went to the meeting where they spoke about it, and I would like to see that maintained, concrete streets. And the other item is that concrete has been proven to last much longer. It's a better dollar value, costs more up front, but the maintenance elements of it are almost nil, where asphalt you have to resurface from time to time, which is another inconvenience for the neighborhood. Everybody has to, move their cars, move out. Streets have to be resurfaced, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in the long run, it's money well spent to go with the concrete. I believe it will last much longer. Obviously, the streets have been there at least 50 years, maybe 80 years. Nobody knows for sure. I don't know any asphalt streets that last that long. So.
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Robert Cowan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, fellow council people. I'd like to read it. I'm going to be short because I'm sure you're getting tired of the same arguments being made year after year, actually. But I would like to comment on four topics. One is the issue of asphalt versus concrete, the cost. And as you've heard tonight, the short-term costs are greater for concrete, but the long-term costs are cheaper. And so obviously the variables that went into that study are important. I think one thing that should be stressed is that the streets out there there's a date stamp on the sidewalks since 1916. It's 100 years ago. And I just wonder how old those streets really are. But in any case, the assumption uses a 50-year life cycle. And in reality, that street's been out there at least 80, maybe 90 years, particularly if it correlates with the date of the sidewalks. It's been 100 years. So if you fudge it a little bit and say that life cycle costs should be spread out over 60 years or 70 years, then the cost savings is greater than 1.3 million. The other comment I want to make has to do with, I want to clarify the tree protection plan that we had talked about maybe 2 meetings ago, I think, where we had, I think there was a general agreement upon the council that if you have major street trees, that may be a need to maybe swerve the curb out a little bit. We're going to keep the curb lines where they are now, but in cases where there's a major tree that's pushing against the existing curb, in most cases the curb is moved out a little bit to provide more growing space, and then the sidewalk is cut into a little bit. So I've gone through 2 cycles in this town. I've lived in my house for 45 years. We had a tree planting program using eucalyptus where it's inappropriate and they were torn out. So I lost the tree cover then. Now there's sycamore trees that are pushing out against the curbs as well. So I hate to lose those trees. I'm going to be dead before the next series of trees get planted. So I would like to protect those trees, and I'd like to have you discuss that. It wasn't mentioned in the staff report specifically this time around. The other has to do with the use of concrete in terms of future trenching. As you know, beginning, I think, 2 years ago, any new construction requires installation of new water lines, bigger water lines. So the street's going to be cut for every time a person does a major addition, and I forget the square footage threshold. So the concrete offers you a chance to. The staff has developed a program where you have smaller spacing in the curve cuts, so I think it's good that you can cut into that sidewalk and street and make it work. I'll stop now, but I want to talk about the character, and a couple people have already talked about the character question. So,
all right, thank you. Wait a minute. Question for staff, because I do remember this from Mr. Collins' communications to us. What is it that we are doing, if anything, with regard to major street trees? Ms. Peterson? Thank you, Mr. Cowan.
Yes, so what we had told council previously is that all of the significant street trees, such as the sycamore, ash, and elm, will be remaining. And if there are some issues with the trunks pushing out the curb, then we would do something we call wowing to get around those trees, but those trees would stay.
Thank you. And did anyone have questions for Mr. Cowan? Seeing none. Our next speaker is Richard Katz.
Hi, I'm Richard Katz. I live on Tate Avenue, and I was here, spoke, I don't know, 1 or 2 times before. I remember the last meeting we had here, there was sort of a consensus that most people were in favor of asphalt, so I'm not sure if that's changing. The other thing is I questioned the historic value of the streets compared to Santa Cruz University, Los Gatos Boulevard, Main Street. Those are all asphalt streets. I'm not sure what the historic value before was or why or what time it was decided to asphalt those streets. I have some neighbors that wanted to just give their vote, and if I could pass those off, I'll do that. They couldn't be here tonight. I'm in favor of asphalt for the maintenance, for the ease of construction, for the lack of disruption when the project is done, for the cost benefit of it. I know the sidewalks say 1915, but I don't I think I heard in the last meeting the concrete streets dated to the 50s. I can't verify that, but that's what I heard. So I just don't feel the historic value of concrete is valid. If that's the main reason to proceed with concrete, I don't feel it's valid. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Katz? See none. Our next speaker, Angelia Dorner.
Hello, Angelia Dorner, a proud resident of the Almond Grove. This was a slide that I used on October 7th of 2014, and I'm glad to say that so much has been accomplished since then that we no longer have community outrage. However, what we're looking for, this slide was also used the following week, is to be sure that all of the streets get completed. The first outreach meeting that we were at, 2 streets were going to be accomplished, and the others were told no way were they even going to be started for over 10 years. So that's where a lot of the outrage came from, and I think we just need to have some kind of equity amongst residents. Just as a reminder to everybody here, this started actually back in 1980 when Council first promised to actually replace all of the concrete streets. September 13th, the outreach meeting, Council says concrete, and then they talked about this 10-year waiting period for everybody else. So May 14, Nichols did this outrageous design that they showed the residents, and the cost to do even one street with that design would have been more than what was currently funded. But starting October 14th, we've come a long way. We've, with your help, have gone through HPC. We've challenged and refined the scopes, the quantities, no narrowing of the streets, protecting our mature trees, and there's still savings on sidewalks where possible. And we've brought some realistic numbers up for life cycle costs. I do want to tell you that there is still room for significant savings in the sidewalk area. I obtained sidewalk analyses for these 2 streets, went ahead and counted all the squares, tried to quantify why they were being taken out or why they were being saved. I wanted to share with you that the ADA-related sidewalks taken out on Broadway is only representing 28% of the total sidewalks, and on Bachman is only 8% of the total sidewalks. I think we'll be achieving even greater results on the sidewalk savings in the Almond Grove area as we have nice flat streets, and the ADA is primarily because of cross-slope limitations. Curbs and gutters, I think we have opportunity for saving there as well. If you'll recall, all of this time, staff has talked about jackhammering all of the concrete out, meaning that all the curbs and gutters, whether they were good or not, would be crumbling to dust. That is not the case. The specifications actually say that saw cutting is necessary to put the concrete into manageable pieces for removal. So I think that there's opportunity, again, to save some of our curbs and gutters. To clarify this conduit scope, this has been added since the last time that we talked about this in October. There's 2,400 linear feet of 2-inch conduit. In the RFP for the new design work, it says that that's going to be placed under the sidewalks for irrigation.
Thank you. Do we have questions, Ms. Dorner? We have one here.
Ms. Dorner, can you go back to the slide before this? Can you, you talked briefly about the ADA and you gave 28%. Could you re-explain what you were trying to get at?
Sure. If you recall, the initial design was to take out 100% of the sidewalks, and the guise for that was to achieve ADA compliance. The primary issue with ADA compliance on the sidewalk situation is the cross slope cannot exceed 2%. That's a new requirement. So initially, it was, well, how much really is ADA non-compliant versus compliant? This analysis was done by the consulting group, square by square, going through these 2 streets to determine whether the square needed to be replaced or not, and whether that was due to ADA, non-compliance, whether it was just deteriorated or old, whether it was cracked, etc. So I just wanted to give these percentages to you because we definitely did need to be taking out 100% of the sidewalks. And the numbers that I know are being used now still include 100% of sidewalks being taken out. And so I do have some estimates that I can provide to you after this meeting as to what I believe additional cost savings will be if that's taken into consideration.
Thank you. Hold on just a minute. Let me, a question of staff. I also noticed in the staff report, as the slide indicates, the reference to Villa Hermosa. Are we doing Villa Hermosa on these streets?
Is this for staff?
Yes.
So not on all of the streets, just in the areas that it's required per our town plan. So there's just a couple locations where some Villa Hermosa is getting done because of cracked or stripping hazards or ADA issues. It's mostly just standard sidewalk.
All right, well, we'll get back to that later. Any other questions for Ms. Dorner? Seeing none, thank you. Next speaker, Tom Boyce.
Good evening, Tom Boyce, 134 Wilder. I think we're getting to know each other fairly well in this room. I'd like to first thank all of you on the council for your continued diligence. It's a great feeling as a resident to feel like you are watching to make this go correctly. Also like to thank town staff, particularly Matt Morley, who has provided me with requested engineering materials, as well as meeting with me. And great Scott, we had a meeting of minds. What I came up from an engineer's point of view and what he came up with his approach were very, very close on what it's going to take to do 10 streets, whether it's either concrete or asphalt. So I feel very, very good that we now have a number that that allows us to consider all 10 streets. The only concern that I have left is shown on the slide here. It's email that I sent to all of you, including staff, suggesting that we have a shortfall of about $700,000 in terms of funding sources. So it's one thing to have the budget, it's the other to have the funding sources. I'm very concerned that for concrete, it's about $2.5 million shortfall, where the sources of that amount have not been identified yet to make sure we can do all 10 streets. My plea is very simple. Do all 10 streets or do none, and let's make sure the money is there that we can go forward. Thank you.
Questions? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Boyce, I want to commend you for the amount of effort that you've put into this project on behalf of the residents of Los Gatos. I wanted to ask you your shortfall numbers. In the staff report, it says in February of 2016, the asphalt, it says the concrete is $16,741,000, and the asphalt is $14,127,000. So the shortfall that you have come up with for $700,000 on the asphalt and the $2.5 million on the concrete, how did you derive those numbers?
I looked at the attachment 1 to the staff report, which showed uses of funds, a column, one for asphalt and one for concrete. One was about 13 million, the other around 12. I can't remember exactly. So I simply took those numbers that the staff said they had identified sources for and subtracted it from the latest staff estimate and said the difference is unidentified funds to make sure we do all 10 streets. Does that help clarify it?
That does help clarify. Thank you.
Question. If we have to make some assumptions, but if I'm looking at page 4 of the staff report, and if we assume concrete is estimated at $16,700,000, asphalt at $14,100,000, and if we, again, going to staff report, have 12,100,000 set aside, a potential for another 2 million. So we have 14 million plus potential there for the streets. Would it be your suggestion that since we don't have the 16 million, we should not do the concrete, that we should only look at asphalt, or what?
Not at all. I spoke with Mr. Morley actually about the funding sources, and there was an indication that there could be future funding sources besides those already listed that could cover the total for concrete. So I'm not suggesting that we take the limitation of what has already been set aside and therefore go with the lower cost, immediate cost option. I myself am neutral between concrete and asphalt. I want to be sure there's enough money on whichever you choose. And I think that the additional funds could be and need to be found if you decide that concrete is the option. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, sir. No other questions? Julie, looks like Julie Colbert.
Hi, my name's Julie Gilbert. I live at 243 Bachman Avenue, and I have been up here several times. I am definitely a supporter of asphalt. I agree with everything that Mr. Katz had to say. In fact, I want to point out I'm actually speaking for several of my neighbors who were not able to be here tonight. Our historic downtown roads are asphalt. At the top of Bachman is asphalt. And that seems to be good enough for, most of Los Gatos. So I feel like it should be good enough for Almond Grove. I've been a resident there for 25 years. Also, I'd like to make sure that our money, stretches further so that we can get all of the streets done. I feel like the time spent also is going to be a real inconvenience for a lot of us. And I believe that asphalt was going to be quite a bit shorter time frame to get it done versus asphalt. And there's a reason that cities are choosing asphalt. If you look at, many other cities, they are choosing asphalt over concrete. And as, what's been stated tonight is that costs are going up. So we already have almost a $3 million shortfall for concrete, and they're expecting that that's going to go higher. So I would like to see asphalt done for all of the streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Gilbert? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Ms. Gilbert, you've been living on Bachman for 25 years, and has the condition of the street always been such that it's been what has been referred to as shatter slab? Has it always been in pretty bad shape, or was it at one point in time in better condition?
It definitely has gotten a lot worse over the years, and in the 25 years that I've been there. So, I'd like to make sure that and see it done. Also, one other thing I forgot to mention is the fact that we want to make sure and have our hardscape stay in place. We don't want to have a lot of just replace the sidewalk and the curbs where needed. So I forgot to mention that prior.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom Sharon. And if you want to speak, please submit one of these cards to staff.
Hi, I'm Tom Sharon. I'm also a resident of Bachman Avenue. And I just wanted to say that I also vote for the asphalt as well, too. Over the years, as just was pointed out, the concrete's turned into a lot of patchwork. And I feel like as the concrete, if it was replaced, it looked great in the beginning, and eventually it will become patchwork too. The asphalt, I think, could be maintained better over time. If we look at Santa Cruz Avenue, as it's probably been pointed out previous to, that looks great. It doesn't seem like anybody was very upset that that turned into asphalt. I don't think it's going to turn anybody away from coming to our town if our streets are all asphalt. I just want to say that.
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none. Gretchen Bell.
I'm Gretchen Bell at 332 Bachman. I kind of have a question about that you mentioned it will start in the middle of May. Is that a pretty set date? and that it could go through October or November. So my question is, how are we going to be incapacitated for those June, July, August, September, October, maybe 6 months? And I've also heard that it doesn't really take that much difference in time with asphalt or concrete. And so that's a question I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Last card I have, Janet Wolf.
Hello, thank you. I've been living at 224 Wilder for 24 years now, and I know there's been a lot of due diligence on this subject and everyone trying to get it right, and I really appreciate that. The one thing that I'm concerned about is that all of the effort has been on getting this project started, only bidding a couple of streets. There's obviously a shortfall in the money, and I'm just concerned that all of the 10 streets are not going to get done. And I'm concerned that right now, right in front of my house, the sidewalks are actually hazardous. They're trip hazards. There's a lot of problems with them. And I think that without a plan of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, whether it be asphalt or concrete, I think every citizen in Almond Grove wants to know that they're going to have safe, nice streets in front of their home.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Wolf? See none. Oh, Mr. Leonardis.
Real quick, what street were you residing on?
224 Wilder.
Wilder, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I have no other cards. No one coming forward. I'm going to close the public testimony of our hearing and go back to staff. If you have anything you'd like to add or if we have questions.
Yes, so I did want to clarify for the Villa Hermosa sidewalk, we'll be replacing Villa Hermosa sidewalk where it currently exists.
And remind me, where does it currently exist?
So it's really right at the intersection of Santa Cruz Avenue.
You're right. Thank you. Other questions for Ms. Peterson? Yes, Ms. Vice Mayor.
Ms. Peterson, in the audience, we had several questions about construction scheduling, as well as the difference in time for whether asphalt or concrete was chosen. Can you speak to those? Sure. So what we've talked with everybody about at the community meetings is for the reconstruction option, reconstruction in concrete, reconstruction in asphalt is fairly similar. So we were talking about 5 months for reconstruction in asphalt and about 6 months for reconstruction in concrete. We did also talk at that time about an overlay option, which was much less time, so there might be some confusion with that.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Ms. Peterson, being that this project is being approached in 2 different phases, is it possible that if this council decides they want asphalt on these 2 streets this evening, and then later on, assuming that the council decides to move forward with the proposal to bid the remaining 8 streets, and assuming at some future date the council votes to have concrete on those remaining 8 streets, I guess the question becomes, is that a possibility that that can occur?
We can do whatever the council desires.
Thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Peterson? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. My question was, there was one concern about the streets turning into a patchwork like we have out there now after 80 years or whatever number we're at. Do we have any better designs to help prevent that?
So the way that the concrete street would be designed, it's designed with saw cutting and 6x6 blocks. So what we had proposed in the council report was that if somebody did have to come in and, let's say, upgrade their water line, or let's say there was an emergency utility repair that would have to happen, what we were recommending in the council report is they would need to replace the entire 6x6 block of concrete. So they couldn't just come in there and saw cut a trench. The whole block would have to be replaced, and that would help with the look.
Other questions? All right, Ms. Vice Mayor.
2 more questions. The construction schedule. during those 5 months, how will residents on the two streets or the future streets be able to get in and out of their property? Will that be something that the consultant as well as staff will be working with each individual resident?
So what we've done is we have actually said in the specifications and the plans that the contractor has to construct the street half a street at a time and has to can only allow 3 days for a resident not to get in and out of their driveway. Now there may be some other ideas that the contractor has about how they can do it more expeditiously, and we'll certainly have that conversation with them.
Ms. Sack?
And a general question. I know we've talked at length about this, but now that we have the bids, let's use the sidewalks and where actual ADA repairs need to happen. The consultant contractor will only get paid for those sidewalks that actually get repaired and touched, correct?
Correct.
And there will be someone on staff verifying which of those segments of sidewalk?
Correct. Well, actually, what we did this time around is we changed the plan. So we actually, in the plans this time, we show sections of sidewalk that are getting saved. So actually, the quantity that we had previously has changed and has come down, and we have actually specifically shown those sections in the plan that are getting saved.
Okay, so then the ADA of the 28% and the 8%, those are the actual sidewalk areas that you've verified will need to actually be worked on.
Well, so again, that was, somebody else's information, so that's not staff's information, but we are very confident that we are replacing only what was requested by council, things that need to be replaced due to ADA requirements, and also sections that are cracked or tripping hazards.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. This is a follow-up to Mr. Rennie's question. Ms. Peterson, you mentioned, let's hypothetically, about a week after the brand new concrete is poured, if that's the way the council decides to go this evening, my water line explodes and I have to dig out a 6x6 section of concrete and replace the whole section so as not to have a cut or a patchwork or like what is going on back there now. What would be the cost to our residents to perform a procedure like that compared to if they were just going to trench asphalt and then repatch the asphalt?
I'm sorry, I don't have that information. I actually did give that out at a community meeting previously, but I don't have that with me.
Thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Peterson? I see none. So I'm going to look to the council for discussion. Motion. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. To me, the question isn't really about concrete or asphalt this evening. It's about equity. It's about doing all 10 streets at one time and finding the funding to do all 10 streets at one time. I don't mind if we have to wait a little bit longer because I think the result will be better for everyone. The way I feel right now is that we could potentially have asphalt on Bachman and Broadway, and we could have concrete on the other 8, or vice versa, or and 2 different contractors. And I would be looking for a more comprehensive solution, a more neighborhood solution, so everybody ends up with the same material. And if we go and we bid the remaining 8 streets and we get the actual costs on those, maybe we could end up with concrete for the price of asphalt. So I'm hesitant to move forward with just putting 2 streets in play at this point in time. I know that we are eager and we've waited a long time as a community for this to occur. I feel like we've made tremendous strides as a council in the last 8 months or so, as Ms. Dorner's slide presentation pointed out. And I feel like we're very close to the finish line of coming up with a comprehensive solution for the whole neighborhood that everybody, I think, will be happy with. But I do believe it has to be done in with one contractor, with one bid at one time, and let that contractor determine the traffic mitigation and the logistics, along with our staff, to come up with the best cost solution for the community. It could be a situation where Someone mentioned, how long are we going to be not able to access our house? Is it May through October or May through November? I don't know for sure. But let's say a contractor could come in and do all these streets in 6 months, all of them, and mitigate the traffic and do everything because they have the wherewithal, the means, the know-how, the equipment, the ability to do that. And I think we can get more of what we want quicker for cheaper if we approach it that way. So I'm hesitant to put forward just 2 streets at this time, but I'm open-minded to hearing what my fellow council members have to say.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. We've been down this road before, and I haven't changed my opinion. And I think trying to get all the streets done at once in 6 months is a fairy tale. I don't see how you can do this project without phasing it. Maybe we can bid them, and then the contractor works. I mean, currently the phasing is planned. Ms. Kashub asked about when it was going to be done, and there's a plan in item 8, which is coming up, that would have her street done in 2019 if we follow all the staff recommendations, and it's basically 2 streets a year. I can't imagine what it would be like trying to live in the Almond Grove if they tried to tear up the whole thing at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense to me. We've delayed this project for many years. We've certainly been at it for the last 2 or 3 years. Hard, but certainly longer than that. We know that to design the streets, the rest of the 8 streets is going to take a year or more. So waiting another year before we then send it out for bid, to me it just makes sense to get started, make the decision on concrete or asphalt, and get started with the first 2 streets, because we know that's the way the phasing makes the most sense.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I didn't want to get into discussing item 8 yet, but maybe I can ask staff what their thoughts are if we send out the bid for the design of the remaining 8 streets, the amount of time that would take to get that back.
If we have that information now.
So for the remaining 8 streets, we're looking at, I believe it was about 14 to 16 months is what the information that came through the proposals.
Thank you. Further discussion. Mr. Leonardis.
Is there any way to speed up that process? Being that Nichols Consultant, who is one of the bidders, so I'm not saying they will be chosen, but they've been working on this project for 5 years and they already have all the information.
So we did ask them to submit proposals with schedules. Of course, we can always request that they try to expedite the schedule.
Thank you.
Discussion? Is this discussion or questions of staff?
This is discussion.
Okay, thank you. Discussion.
In response to Mr. Rennie's comments, I don't anticipate the whole neighborhood would be torn up at once. I would leave that to the expertise of the contractor, who we're paying a lot of money to, potentially $14 million, potentially $16 million. And I don't think they would tear up the whole Almond Grove at one time. So I just wanted to add that comment. I would leave the expertise to the person bidding the job. They have an incentive to get in there and finish it as quickly as possible and do the best job they could possibly do for Los Gatos and earn their fair wages on that job, so we hire them again someday. So I don't think they're going to be there to irritate us or torture us with this process.
Discussion, motion? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. I think at this point I might as well make a motion, and it doesn't look like there's too much more discussion other than between Mr. Leonardis and I, so I'll go ahead and make a motion. In my opinion, the concrete is the better choice. I'd like to make a motion to go ahead and accept the bid for Broadway and Bachman on the concrete. And there are many reasons. I realize that we had 3 speakers that spoke of asphalt. And I realize that we still need to find some more money for the concrete. We currently this year are running $5 million surplus that we can go into capital funds. If we're able to keep that up over the next couple years, we'll certainly be able to add the extra couple $1 million, $3 million that we're going to need by 2019 to get the last streets done if we follow the current plan. So I don't see any problem with that. I think, I've received several emails from residents that have said they had to spend extra money on their houses to follow the historic rules of the almond grove, and they want to know why we wouldn't follow the historic rules of keeping the concrete. So that makes a lot of sense to me. There's kind of the environmental aspect of it also. We know concrete, certainly the color is a cooler and is going to keep the temperature in the almond grove down. So there's added advantage to that. When you look at the life cycle costs of it, actually asphalt costs more over the longer term. So that makes more sense. I could add to my motion. I'll go ahead and add to it, and if council members don't like it, they can ask me to take it out. But I'll add in the 5-year no-cut rule, and I think the other suggestion was that the whole 6 years, the whole 6x6 slabs have to be replaced. Was that the other? Yeah. So that's my motion.
Just for clarification, your motion is to, it's actually part, is for the concrete portion, which is part of what one of staff's suggestion, but you've added a 5-year no cut. And what was the other additor?
Must replace the 6x6, the whole 6x6 slab when work is done.
All right, thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second? Well, I'm going to second it for purposes of discussion, because I know I can do that. And what I wanted, this is always difficult. Every time it's come before us, it's been difficult. Every year it comes before us, it's difficult. Every decade it comes before it, it's difficult. And it's not getting any easier. Well, it is getting a little easier, because I want to commend the people in this audience and the community who have provided additional and very beneficial information. I actually do not have a strong opinion with regard to concrete versus asphalt, and so that's why I was able to second this motion for the purpose of discussion. And as far as the one thing that I'm very firm about is I want funding for the entire almond grove. And this project, as proposed, is $3 million plus. We have $12 million plus already put aside. We have the potential for $2 million plus more, which can be put aside. And then, as Mr. Rennie pointed out, we may have a surplus funding in the near future. So I can go basically either way on concrete versus asphalt, but I want the money to be there, ready to go for the whole neighborhood, the whole of Almond Grove, and I'm comfortable that that can be done. Further discussion, Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. We have $12.2 million sitting there already, and we have potentially $2.1 million more dollars sitting there, which would cover the cost of asphalt according to our report for all 10 streets. There are people who spoke that they wanted asphalt, which personally I think would be a better solution, because I think if in the 1950s, when they put concrete in there, if they would have chose asphalt, none of us would be in this room tonight. And I think 50 years from now, there's going to be a room full of people, and they're going to be trying to wrangle over a $75 million bid to tear out all these streets and replace them again. So I feel sorry for that future council. Hopefully I will not be up here. There are no term limits, but maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'll be 95, 96 years old. But really, I think the important thing is, Mayor Spector mentioned, we have to put the funding in, and as well as many of the speakers, we have to put the funding in place first. Whether it's concrete or whether it's asphalt is a big question mark at this point, because I think we could potentially get concrete streets for the price of asphalt if we bid all 10 streets at a time. But the only way we are really assured to get anything, as some of our speakers mentioned, is if we bid all 10 streets at one time. If we do 2 streets now, and it's an election year, I don't know how many of these council members may run again. Who knows, right? Something could happen. It's possible that these streets may never get done. We might do Broadway, we might do Bachman, they might be concrete, they might look great, and then the other 8 streets might go another 15, 20, 30 years. We have no guarantee unless we do it all at one time and we have all the funding in place. So for me, it's an all or none. I think Mr. Boyce mentioned that. He has done a significant amount of work on this project. He knows what he's talking about. I think it's the only fair approach. It was selected that Bachman and Broadway be done first for whatever reason by the consultant that we hired. But that was under a different set of assumptions. That was under the assumption that we had $3.7 million or $4 million to spend on only 2 streets. And then they tried to design a complete streets project and did a bunch of things that we've moved far away from based on our community's input. The community input I heard this evening was, let's get all the funding in place and let's do it in a fair manner, handle this in a fair manner. So I'm not going to support the motion currently. I would support a motion to perhaps postpone the vote on this until we get the funding in place and we see what happens with the next item, item 8, whether the council even decides to move forward with the bidding for the remaining 8 streets. Because what if this council decided that we're not going to move forward on the bidding of the remaining 8 streets? Guess what? You have 2 concrete streets on the way and nothing else for the remaining Almond Grove. So for that very reason, I cannot support this motion.
Further discussion. I see 2 hands. Mr. Schultz? Since I seconded for the purpose of discussion and we are discussing, and at some juncture, do I have to change my second in order to allow it to go to motion? To decision?
No.
Okay, great. Ms. Jensen.
Thank you. That was part of my question. I'm not sure where I am on the motion, assuming that it's going to go to a vote. I was actually the lone council person who did not vote to create the dedicated fund for Almond Grove. I appreciate and understand that those streets need to be repaired. At the same time, Almond Grove represents 3% of the total miles of roadway in the town of Los Gatos. The pavement condition index in Los Gatos is at a 67 for $440,000 a year, which is the savings between concrete and asphalt. We could raise that index town-wide 1 point per year. That's money that we're not spending. If we don't make that investment in our infrastructure, our streets around the entire town will continue to crumble, and everybody else in town will be in here like you saying, why haven't you fixed our streets? So it's a question, as a representative of the entire town, is where should those funds be spent? Should they be spent for the benefit of the entire town or for a particular community? And I'm for repaving the Almond Grove, don't get me wrong. But the question is, should we dedicate $12 million for the next 5 or 6 years just for that one thing? So my question that I asked earlier tonight was, well, if we save $440,000 by choosing asphalt versus concrete, can we use that $440,000, for example, other streets in the town? The answer is no. If we did have $400,000, we could do 12 intersections of green bike lanes, for example. We could use it to start funding a senior center. We could use it for other purposes in the town. So I appreciate the gravity of the condition of the streets in the Almond Grove. I do. However, I hope that the council will at some point consider whether or not we want to dedicate so much of our available funds to 3% of our streets. That said, we've done it. The council has made that decision. Where I am on deciding concrete versus asphalt, I'm not sure. I do think that we should do 2 streets versus waiting for 16 months to bid another 8 streets. I don't think that makes sense. When and if we choose a consultant to do the other 8 streets, we can certainly say to that consultant, design for concrete or design for asphalt, depending upon what the decision the council makes tonight. We have the power to figure that out now. It's not a variable that we can't control. So I wouldn't be in favor of delaying for the entire 10 streets. But I do have a question on concrete versus asphalt, so I'd be curious what other people, where they are on that.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I wanted to respond to two things. So Mr. Leonardis would like to do all 10 streets at once because I guess he thinks it's going to save money. Maybe it will. I'm really in favor of getting started, as Ms. Jensen said. If we really want to do a lot of streets all at once, why don't we get started on the first 2 streets and then bid 8 streets all at once? So what's the difference between 8 and 10? We can still save money and we can get the project started. On the second point about I forgot my second point. I'll pass for now.
All right. When it comes back to you, just raise your hand. Further discussion. Ms. Sayak.
Okay, I think I'm the only one that hasn't weighed in. So I think it's easier for me to start with where I can support the motion. I am in favor of moving forward with the 2 streets. I know that there is the Costco effect that someone mentioned of 10 versus 8, and I do think we will get that Costco effect with the remaining 8, regardless of the material we choose, asphalt or concrete. And to the issue of equity, I do feel that we're putting all 10 streets into play. We're moving forward with 2, and we're also in the next agenda item, hopefully moving forward with the remaining 8, with a construction schedule and money set aside. Now, I realize that money is not sufficient, but if we continue, as Mr. Rennie said, with our current fiscal effectiveness, we can start to identify revenue to meet those needs. Now, where I'm struggling with is what actual material we use. And understanding how many needs we have in this town, it's very difficult for me to look at whether it's 440 this year or whether we're looking at a $2 million overlay over the next 5 years. There are so many needs that are pressing in this town that I can easily quantify where we can use that $2 million if we were to move forward with just asphalt and having that cost savings. But one thing that keeps holding me back on that final decision is there were decisions that were made before I even came on board. And that's the historic ordinance that many people spent significant time and effort into, and they've decided that the Almond Grove, those 10 streets, that concrete was a significant material for them that further enhances the historic district. And that's not something that I take lightly, and that's not something that I wish to ignore, even if I'm looking at a $2 million cost savings, especially if you start looking at the 50-year lifespan of this and the potential maintenance savings that we can have. So I'm really, in terms of material, I'm really on the fence, but I am leaning towards concrete, and I am leaning towards moving forward tonight with the 2 street, and then getting to the next agenda item and just starting out with the next 8, and let's just finalize a plan, and let's just stick with it, and let's just move on.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. So we have a great unknown 16 months from now. We send out, we get the bids or whatever on the remaining 8 streets, and we send it out, and we get one contractor back, and he says, I want $25 million for concrete. What do? It would be better to know that information up front. There's no guarantees in the future what can happen. And I'm not trying to use scare tactics here. I'm trying to approach this from a business sense, logically speaking. You know, what if the contractor poured half of Bachman and half of Broadway, and then he poured the other half and the other half, and he detoured the people through the neighborhood, so your whole street didn't have to be ripped out from October or May through November or whatever. I think those are decisions that can be worked on. Regarding to what Councilmember Jensen said, it is a disproportionate amount of money being thrown at one neighborhood. It doesn't say in the deeds of all your homes that you're entitled to any kind of asphalt or concrete streets. So there is a big difference between 12 million, 14 million, and 16 million, considering this town only puts about $2 million towards resurfacing about 50 or 60 streets in 1 year on an annual basis. So if we can get the cost down, that is very important because it is the taxpayers' funds that we're using. Again, I think it's premature to vote between concrete and asphalt at this time. I understand people are tired of the discussion and they want to move forward with something at this point. I want to touch on the historical aspects of the neighborhood. The history lies in the houses, the unique character of the Moe strips, the 1916 date stamp in the sidewalk, the hitching post where you hook up your horse, that's still over there on Tate Avenue. It's all those little characteristics that initially, before we went through this vetting process, we're all going to just get totally ripped out and homogenized. And as Mr. Cohen alluded to, the heritage trees. So we've come a long way to preserve the history of the neighborhood through our discussions, which I think is a good thing. But regarding the material, the history that I remember of the concrete in downtown Los Gatos, it's always been shattered, and it's been a tripping hazard, and it hasn't, I mean, you could say we got 50 years of life out of it, but 40 of those years were crumbling. So I kind of look at when we do a 50-year life cycle cost thing, it's quite irrelevant. Like I said, if those streets were paved in asphalt back in 1950, none of us would be here tonight. You'd all be very happy because all your streets would be nice. And it wouldn't have made a darn difference when you were buying your home, whether those streets were paved in asphalt or concrete. You would be still loving to live there, probably more. In the last several years, Royce Street, which was concrete, was completely ripped out and replaced with asphalt downtown. We had, I think it was part of Hernandez, part of Glen Ridge, asphalt overlay over the concrete. So again, I'm not advocating one way or another with concrete, but I will not use that as an argument at this point in time to move forward with concrete. I want to get more information on the numbers, more information on the costs, and let's see if what we come up with bidding all 10 at one time. I think it's the logical approach. I think putting the funding in place is the logical approach, or at least having planned funding. I mean, again, it's easy to say we'll come up with more money later, but we have a catastrophic disaster that happens to the town, and we need to do some things to cover that. The first place we're going to go is to our reserves. Then we're going to have to replace those reserves, or some unknown variable that could cause this not to occur. Plan for the worst, or you can approach it business-wise and have a plan.
Further discussion? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I wanted to, I think, probably ask staff a question, but first make a point for Ms. Sayak made me think of. In terms of if we were to go with the asphalt, your concern was the money. But if you look at the town maintenance program, the industry standard is within 7 years we'd be spending money to do a slurry seal. The town thinks they can push it to 10 years. So we're going to be spending money already on repair work, and we're going to be closing the streets down 5 years after we finish getting them all done. We'll be back on the first street if we do asphalt, and then it's 20 years slurry seal, and then 30 years a rubber cape seal. So I'm not sure that we're really saving that much money, and we're certainly, I don't think, saving any trouble. The concrete maintenance is 3% of the slabs after 14 years, which is 3% is a pretty small number. And then my question for staff was, if we don't make a decision tonight, but then we ask you to go design all the streets first. So if we haven't decided on asphalt or concrete, how much extra cost is the design work going to be? Because now they get a design for both streets. You may not have that number, but make a wild guess.
So We don't have that number. I mean, we would have to ask the consultant that. Ultimately, for the 2 streets, as you may recall, our initial number for providing asphalt design and also bidding both concrete and asphalt was about $25,000 for 2 streets.
If I could follow.
Is this another question of staff?
It's just sort of the same one. Right. So it was 25 to. I thought we designed both ahead of time, and then we had to spend 25 to do the extra.
We had done the design in concrete, and we had to come back to council to ask. It was a long discussion on how we were going to go about getting the design changed. And ultimately what we did is we didn't pay any additional money to get the design changed. We just didn't complete the remainder of Tate Avenue. So we used that additional money that it would cost to complete Tate to do the design, to put the curb line in the new location, to bid the project out for both asphalt and concrete, and also to get a design for asphalt reconstruction.
So if I multiply by 10, that's what the cost would be then for redoing in both?
I can't say. I mean, we would have to ask the consultant what it would take for them, and there would be an additional cost.
Okay, thank you.
All right, go back to thank you, Ms. Peterson. Go back to council. Just very maybe simply for me, over all of these years, over all of these decades, you have all testified. You don't necessarily agree with one another. Some might think asphalt, some might think concrete, some might think trees, some might think Hernandez. But the point is that none of you is wrong. You just have a different perspective. You've heard different perspectives up here on the council. None of us is wrong. We're just weighing the facts differently. And did I see Mr. Leonardis' hand up? Because I was ready to call for the question. Mr. Leonardis?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. One of the speakers raised that there was an additional 2,400 feet of conduit added on Broadway, I believe it was, that was not in the original bid. So I was wondering what that's for. Why is it only on Broadway? Will all that conduit be added potentially if this council decides to move forward later with the remaining 8 streets? Is there going to be consistency?
Ms. Peterson?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the conduit came up in the very beginning with our discussions with the community, and it was a thought that it would be a good idea to have an empty conduit. So if telecommunications did come down the street, there would be a conduit there for them to put, their utility in without having to rip up the whole street. In light of also our 5-year no-cut policy, we thought it was a good idea. We had actually always planned on putting in the conduit. Ultimately, we need to wait for the finalization of the design in order to determine exactly where that conduit could be placed based on where the design ended up. The conduit is in the street. It is on both Bachman and on Broadway.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. All right. I don't see any more discussion. I don't see any more questions. And so I am going to call for the question. We have a motion. And all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. We now go to agenda item 8. Which is PPW Job 1331, Almond Grove Street Rehabilitation Project 411-811-0003. Do we have a staff report? Yes, we do.
Thank you very much. Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works. Thank you. Great first step for tonight's agenda. That was great. Here today to talk about the Almond Grove design for the next 8 streets and what that might look like. I wanted to start with the same slide that you saw a little bit earlier and talk about where we're at on this slide. So just before this item, you did the item that was the bid for construction, and as you were informed and have been told before that's with little discretion and you're locked into the low bid there. An RFP is a little bit different on the lower part of the chart, and we're at the final square, the black square at the bottom, where we're doing qualifications-based award. Qualifications is set up for an RFP, and the requirements are that the assessment on the consultants in an RFP in a service type of an agreement be based on qualifications and not on the cost. So with this, we established, and I want to take you through the RFP process a little bit. I think it's important to note that we spent quite a bit of time putting this process in place ahead of time. We wanted it to be a solid process. We wanted it to stand up to review, and we wanted it to be something that we could be comfortable with as we brought it forward here tonight. As I said, the criteria must emphasize qualifications. We set the ratio at 80% for qualifications and 20% for costs. So this alludes to the fact that yes, cost can play a factor, and it did actually play a factor in this assessment, but it wasn't to be the determinative factor. So the qualifications outweighed the cost. We also put together a very balanced review team for this particular RFP. We brought in folks from outside the town to be able to do the review, including the former town engineer from Campbell, who just completed a major street reconstruction project herself, so had good experience with that and knew what to look for as we were going through the RFP reviews. We also set up a 3-phase evaluation process. The idea between the 3 phases was to allow individual steps along the way that allowed for structure and accountability throughout the process. So jumping into the process, the first phase was the evaluation. We received submittals in response to the RFP from 5 consultants. The consultants did, the submittals were provided to the review team, and the review team took those submittals and did a review of those based on the criteria that were set in advance. The rating criteria are in your packet. They're attached for your review. And ultimately, the rating team, as they finish their evaluation, comes together in a meeting and reviews their ratings together. The purpose of the meeting together is to make sure that all 3 members of the rating team were seeing the same things as they're reviewing the RFP package, and that they have a good, clear understanding of what the submittals were. So stepping it through phase by phase, you have the phase 1 results. You can see that there's a group of 4 consultants here that are really tight in their scores in the second column, all in the 71 to 72 point range, and this is out of a score of up to 80 in this particular phase, 80 out of the 100. The other 20 will be the cost. And on the right column is the far right column are the rankings at this particular point, and you can see where the individual companies fell out in the rankings. There was one company that the panel felt was not up to the ratings of the others, and that was the outlier in this particular stage. So now we factored in cost in phase 2, and again, the cost was formulaic. There wasn't an interpretation associated with that. The criteria had been set ahead of time at 20%. The lowest cost receives the full points, so the lowest cost would receive 20 points. And each of the other cost allocations would receive points as a percentage of the lowest cost. So for instance, a cost that was 10% higher than the low cost would receive 18 points. A cost that was half again as much would receive 10 points, and so on. So to help with that, we do have a cost calculator. This is what we use to plug in the numbers, and it calculates the point allocations. You can see how the point allocations spread across based on the costs that were received. An important part was that the evaluation team, up until the point when they had done their first ratings, had not seen the cost. So the cost was not part of the evaluation up front and simply applied at this point here without the evaluation team having the advanced knowledge of it. You can see, especially on the top consultant, how the cost was very impactful with the high number that came in there. And it did affect the ratings across the 5 consultants. So this slide highlights the cost phase and what happens when we add the 80 points and the 20 points from cost, and what, as you can follow across and see the rankings after the second phase. and what happens to each of the consultants as the cost is applied. So it certainly affects the outliers on both sides. It left the company that was previously at the 5th level, still at the 5th level, but did play a factor in the company that had been rated number 1 previously, because the number of points that company received were so few. So in this particular case, I think the cost allocation did its job. It really helped to right-size the evaluation and really helped us hone in on the appropriate vendor. We didn't want to stop there on the design cost, so we did this little gut check back to where we thought the cost should be. The design cost in a typical construction project should be in that 8 to 14% range. We saw on phase 1 that we approved bids on a few minutes ago that there was a 9% cost for the concrete and an 11% cost for the asphalt. This is the design cost as a percentage of the total construction cost. And we estimate, based on a revised engineer's estimate, that the next phase for 8 streets, based on the quotes that we have, the bids that we have now through the RFP, that the design cost will be 6% for concrete or it would have been 8% by asphalt. Since it seems to be we're on the concrete phase, that's where we can head for now. So the third phase of our 3-phase process is the interview phase. This is project team focused, so this takes the paper review and the costs and brings the top companies in. The top 3 came in for interviews with the evaluation team. It was an opportunity to check in on that project team and really, in the end, show the experience and the lack of experience that the various teams had. It was important that in this particular case for the town that we include a significant discussion with the consultants on schedule, on cost containment, and on their ability to do public outreach. And we saw that in the teams, and we were able to probe on those elements as we reviewed the teams through the interview process. So in this slide, we've rolled up everything into the 3-phase program. You can see the results on the next to last column, column G, what the revised total of points is, and in the column just to the left, what the interview points were. Clearly, NCE stood out in this particular case. The reason that NCE stood out was because they had a very deep team that they brought forward. They have significant concrete pavement experience, which was very vital, with the ability to provide concrete design delivery and essential for this particular project. None of the other consultants brought any depth at all in the concrete side. They also have the experience across pavement. We did reference checks on NCE through multiple cities, and all of them spoke very highly of them, and NCE was able to provide us with solid references. We'll conclude with we feel like this was a very solid RFP process. It was well thought out ahead of time, very structured to provide that review and to make sure that we had a process that could stand up to questions. And that leaves us at our recommendation, which is to authorize the town manager to negotiate and execute an agreement with NCE. That concludes our staff's report, and we're available for questions as needed.
Thank you. Questions of staff? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Morley, when I look at your cost points, we got 19.5 versus 20, NCE versus Sandus. I guess the question is, it seems like there's an insignificant difference in points. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, if there had been a tie, if the cost submittals had been the same, the 2 companies could have actually received 20 points if they'd been that close. So there was no net zero in terms of the
So in this case, Sandus was the winner. Is that correct? Because they had more points?
They were the lowest cost, yes.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Morley. Now open the public testimony. If you want to speak, please submit a card. First speaker, Robert Cohen. All right, we have Mr. Cohen is not going to speak. Dennis Grist. All right, pass. Well, I know that Mary Ellen Kashoub's not going to speak because I saw her leave. Angelia Dorner. If anyone else wants to address us on this issue, please submit one of these cards. This is the last card I currently have.
Angelia Dorner, a proud resident of the Almond Grove. I am definitely very much against rehiring Nichols to do any work in connection with this project. They started out with the worst community outreach process possible, which is what got all of us up into our sort of fluffed up our dander seriously from the get-go. Had absolutely no community input whatsoever. Going back to their initial 2011 report, the cost information that they put in that, and which has been continued to be repeated over and over again, was absolutely not realistic. The project that they did in 2011 actually included all of the asphalt streets above the Almond Grove as well as the Almond Grove. They estimated $6.8 million to do all of those asphalt streets up above the Almond Grove. And Caperso was very happy to say that it only cost $900,000 to do what the town felt was required on all of those streets. I have zero confidence in their cost estimation processes. They continue to make errors. They continue to double count intersections, things which is absolutely are inexcusable. And all of that work on all of those streets cost less than $40,000. My feeling is that is what, when they got the rubber stamp for the $300,000 contract in the first place. There were no solicitations for that. They got $300,000 design contract, and I believe that it started this paying forward process, which right now they're looking to be hired again because we're probably going to be paying them forward for something that they haven't charged for us, haven't charged us for yet. Nichols' $300,000 contract has not been completed. Bachman and Broadway design bids are complete. Tate only done, supposedly at 70%. Last minute, since October of 15, there was a change in the fundamental design of asphalt. All along, they've been saying that it was 4.5 asphalt on top of 8-inch aggregate base. Then all of a sudden, these bids came in, and it was changed to 8-inch full-depth asphalt. Why was that done? Why wasn't, if that was considered the best option for this town and on these streets, why wasn't that considered in the very early on stages of these designs? And where is their loyalties? One of the issues that I have with the analysis that staff did is that there was no rate mix analysis on the costs, whether the mix of staff personnel and the cost components. Nichols' blended rate increased 10%. Due to 2% to rate, 8% due to using more experienced people. I wanted to tell you that if one person worked full time, they could get this thing accomplished in 2 years. 5 people could have all of these streets designed using their hours in 5 months. So this idea of saying that it's going to take a year and a half to do design on these things is ridiculous.
Question. I understand what you're saying about your vision or your seeing Nichols not having credibility. You saw staff's report, and its analysis. What do you think the outcome should have been, if not Nichols?
I have not had access to any of the other proposals that were submitted, nor their cost analyses, so I have not been able to look at anything to make a different decision. But I can tell you that I definitely do not have credibility in Nichols' numbers or anything that they've presented so far.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none. We have no other questions. I have no other cards. So I am now closing the public testimony portion of this public hearing. First of all, ask staff if they have any other questions. Council, if they have any other questions of staff. Mr. Rennie?
Guess I'll ask some questions. Thank you, Mayor Spector. So I was thinking about some of Mrs. Dorner's points, and I do recall Nichols had pretty bad community outreach. Are we going to require any more community outreach? That's the first question.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. The town has dictated where the community outreach comes, and we've really stepped it up and made significant efforts at community outreach over the last couple of years, and we expect to continue that community outreach through the construction project on the first 2 streets, and definitely through the design and providing information to the residents through the other 8 streets.
So does, if I could just follow.
Go ahead.
So does that mean it's pretty much irrelevant which contractor we pick in terms of community outreach, that you're going to control that?
We made it a significant portion of the evaluation, and it weighed in significantly on our selection process, in that the consultants that were, as they were ranked through the process, were ranked on their ability to provide that service, amongst other things.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Morley, I may not remember everything as precisely as Ms. Dorner, but I do remember that this elongated process that we have been going through was at least in part associated with Nichols. And so, as a council person, why should I be more comfortable now with the Nichols recommendation?
So I would go back to the statement that I made a second ago, that the direction that Nichols follows is largely provided by staff. So, for instance, on the public outreach, that's guided and driven by staff. The change in design that occurred along the way was driven by staff. Those are directions that Nichols takes by staff. In terms of staff's assessment of how Nichols has performed throughout the project, we are comfortable that they've provided a great project for us to bid and award earlier this evening, and will do so for the future projects. We followed that up with a review of their references. They are the premier pavement design company in California, at least. They do a significant amount of research. They work for do concrete replacement for the San Francisco airport. They do work for the Federal Highway Administration. They're well experienced, and they know their stuff when it comes to concrete.
Thank you. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I'm prepared to go forward with the motion at this time, and that would be to go with the staff.
Hold on. Yes, you after see if there's any more questions of staff. All right, Ms. Sayoc.
Okay, so having made the decision earlier to move forward with concrete with the other four, you mentioned that Nichols had significant experience in concrete. What about the other four? For example, Wilsey Ham, who came in second, do they have any experience in concrete?
Neither of the other four teams brought a concrete expert with them, and so we have reservations about proceeding with concrete with the other teams. If for some reason you were to decide not to go with Nichols, we would not recommend at all awarding to one of the other consultants.
And follow up, if I may.
Go ahead.
In the request for proposal, was there a discussion of either material?
Yes, there was.
So, and it was clear that a decision had not made?
That's correct. The decision was to be made, we anticipated tonight.
Okay, thanks.
All right, this is questions of staff at this point. Mr. Rennie?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I do have a second question. So I'm a little less familiar with this process. Normally with the construction bid, we have to take the lowest bidder. So here I understand we don't have to take the lowest bidder, but you created all this criteria which spit out a winner. And so we don't have to really take that winner either in this process?
So the clarification there for you is that the evaluation that's done through the staff work is done based on criteria other than cost, with cost playing a small factor somewhere along the way, and that was our 20% factor. The recommendation from staff and the information that you have before you tonight is to award to NCE. You have, obviously, in your purview alternatives, we would not recommend, based on our analysis of the consultants that were participating, the award to any of the other consultants. We don't think that there's a team behind them that could support this project.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions of staff? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Morley. And Mr. Leonardis, you have a motion.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I did go and read all the packets for all the bidders, and I found them to be quite impressive. I think any one of them would be capable of designing these streets. Quite frankly, a lot of them worked for Los Gatos in the past. It's kind of unfortunate that those packets weren't included as part of the staff report. But nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead with my motion. I'm going to go with the recommendation on page 1, but I'm going to substitute the word NCE Engineers with Sandus, who is the lowest cost bidder, saves the town $18,000. And for those who think $18,000 isn't a lot of money, I invite you to write a check. And then whatever number, the 762,190 gets substituted with the 674,800 and the 10% contingency. And I also want to say that the streets will be designed for concrete and asphalt at this point, because we don't understand where the funding is yet on those two. And the existing curb lines and everything as was done before in the previous estimate, and that's my motion.
All right, we have a motion which follows the staff recommendation, except substituting Sandus for Nichols and the amount of $674,800 in lieu of the $762,190. Do we have a second? All right, the motion dies for lack of a second. May I have discussion or another motion? Ms. Saya, a question of staff? All right, we have another question of staff.
If you had said that if we were to choose one of the four, that it would be staff's recommendation not to move forward with these four because they don't have experience in concrete. So then what would you recommend the alternate process to be? Would you go out for another RFP?
So the alternative would be to go out for another RFP to see if we could find a consultant that has concrete experience that could design the project. We don't know where we would come in in terms of cost with that particular project, and where we'd have to reach to get that consultant. We do think that NCE is capable. We haven't heard substantial information or any verifiable information on why they can't perform or why they haven't been performing, other than some misinformation that's come forward to the council verbally. There has been nothing substantiated that we've seen that doesn't justify moving forward with Nichols.
Ms. Sayak?
Second question is, if we were to move forward with a different RFP, two parts of this is, I guess, what time delay are we talking about in terms of the entire process?
So we'd be, sort of back of napkin quickly here, we'd be looking at probably a 3 or 4 month time frame to recast the RFP, and we already have the document, so that's going to cut out a little bit off, but say 3 to 4 months to do that. That puts us into, when you factor in design time in order for that consultant ultimately to come up with a document, it puts us a little bit past the ability to bid it for next summer, so we would miss a construction cycle that way. But otherwise, I think that's the ultimate impact, is one construction cycle.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see, do we have any other questions? I thought I saw questions, but I don't see. Oh, I know what the question was. It was mine. You're saying that you would not recommend the other applicants because of their lack of concrete expertise. When you did the RFP, didn't you include as a criteria expertise in concrete and asphalt?
We absolutely did, and some of the consultants were able to provide the significant concrete experience, as Nichols was able to. Others tried to bring in additional consultant services that they thought would make the case for them, and some of them just weren't able to bring somebody to the team that had construction experience and worked off of informing us that they felt like they could design it in concrete in spite of that lack of experience.
Thank you. Any other questions of staff? Ms. Sayak?
Okay, so I guess I'm having trouble with this. So I'm looking at attachment 3. And after phase 1, let's be specific now, Hatchmont McDonald came in first after the submittal phase. They must have indicated something in there that they could work with concrete, right?
Yeah, so oftentimes what you see in writing and what you explore in an interview, much like a resume and a job interview, are different things, and you get different information out of the next stage in the process. In the interviews, we required that they bring forward their project lead and the members that were going to be on their team specifically, and that was very telling to us, and that's why you saw the change in the scores on the on that third phase.
Okay. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Siock. Anyone else? Mr. Leonardis.
I just have a comment that I don't have any confidence in this process.
Do we have any other questions of staff? Thank you, Mr. Morley. I'm going to go back to the council for a discussion motion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I'll go ahead and put a motion on the table, see if we can get some discussion or move forward. So, I'm having trouble seeing why we don't like Nicholson. Everything seems to indicate they're the ones with all the experience. They're giving us a decent cost bid. I certainly wouldn't go with Sanis or whatever their name was. They were scored 56, while the others were in the 70s. So that's definitely not a right idea. Staff seems to be saying go out for another RFP, but I suspect we might end up with the same result again. So I'm going to go ahead and make the motion that we accept staff's recommendation to go with NCE for an amount not to exceed this $762,190, which includes the 10% contingency.
We have a motion. Is there a second? The motion dies for lack of second. May we have another motion? Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Again, I will move to recommend Sandus, and we'll put in the proper amounts in the paragraph on the staff recommendation. And we will send the bid out for concrete streets only at this point.
All right, we have a motion for Sandus with appropriate amount of funding and for concrete only. Do we have a second? Motion dies for lack of second. May I have discussion or another motion? Ms. Siock.
So this is not a motion. This is discussion, and I'm looking to staff for help. In an ideal world, we would move to the second best, which is in this, according to attachment 3, Wolseley-Ham. But what I'm hearing is they have absolutely no experience in concrete. And so there's no confidence that they would be able to design the remaining 8 streets.
That's correct.
So the question, not knowing the full details of this industry, is this something where you would feel confident Wolseley-Ham could subcontract out so that we have a brand new consultant, we address some of the issues raised in terms of uncomfortableness with NCE, but we bring in the expertise that's necessary. What I want to do is I want to move us forward, but I don't necessarily like the options available tonight.
Yeah, I understand the challenge with the options, and that's a struggle and something that we thought long and hard about as we were bringing this forward. And again, we haven't been able to identify the specifics with NCE of why folks are uncomfortable with them. They're here if anybody wanted to ask them questions about their experience or their background or to grill them a little bit on who they are and what they're about. We are in that situation where we don't have a recommendation beyond NCE because there just was no concrete experience behind it. In terms of subcontracting further, they were directed to bring forward a team. We expected their team to have concrete and asphalt experience, and those teams did not. I would assume by that they don't have that resource at their discretion, but I can't speak for that for sure.
Okay.
Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I mean, my recollection of reading through all of the application packets that were not included in our staff report was that they were very capable teams of people who did build streets, some of them in Los Gatos, some that included concrete and asphalt. This isn't rocket science here. I also have a recollection of Nichols Consulting being pushed through as a consent item, which was supposed to be a $50,000 or less item, I think, at the time, which ended up being a $300,000 contract. It was predetermined that they were going to design Broadway and Bachman. They were going to design it in a complete streets format. They held community meetings and they upset a bunch of people. Then they designed the streets with concrete as a complete streets, and then come up with an idea to put asphalt over the old concrete. Then we had to pay them even more money just to have an asphalt design so we can have the information. I don't know how all that came about, but I can understand why the credibility has been damaged with this council person and the community at this point. So again, I'm not comfortable going forward with them. I believe in some of the other applicants. I think they would be perfectly capable of these jobs. So I have a tendency to go for the lowest cost bidder. Like I said, if $18,000 is insignificant, somebody pick up the checkbook. I'm sure the art docents or the Main Street Bridge could use that money. I perfectly believe that Sandus Corporation is capable of moving forward with this proposal and providing us competent work. And we're supposed to check their work. So if we're incompetent, that's our fault.
Ms. Jensen.
A question for Mr. Morley. In response to the Vice Mayor's question, you said that with respect to the second and third place teams, for example, that they were asked to bring their team forward, and you assumed that because they didn't bring concrete people that they didn't have them. Would it be possible, rather than going out for an entire new RFP, you invite back the second, third, fourth place teams and say, hey, we particularly want to talk to you about concrete. Put your best foot forward. You come back after the interview and you tell us how they did, rather than making assumptions about whether they had that expertise or not.
Yes, I think we could do that.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I was actually thinking along the same lines, was going to actually maybe make a motion to some to that effect, but I wanted to ask the questions about the delay. What effect, if we ask you to, do as Ms. Jensen suggested, and maybe also the council can explore understanding why we don't like Nichols a little bit more. How much time do you think that's going to take, and will that have any effect on getting into, missing a build cycle?
And let me tag on to that question. What's the fastest you can do it?
Sort of off the cuff, I would expect we could be back in 6 weeks to the council, assuming availability of the consultants. I don't know that would be a challenge. What will that do to the overall cycle? I don't know without sitting down and talking to them. It's possible, depending on who brings forward experiences, the experience that we need. It's possible that they could expedite it and complete it in time for next year, but at this point, by the time we get back in 6 weeks and we go through our contract process, it really starts to push the edge there on being able to make that next construction cycle.
What if that was a condition of the discussion? That it'd have to be prepared, whoever it is, the companies would have to be prepared for the next construction cycle.
So we could provide that date and have them speak to that, as well as their ability to bring additional expertise.
Other questions? Discussion? Motion? Ms. Jensen.
All right, I'll make a motion that Mr. Morley and the team that did the interview process and evaluation process invite the second, third, and fourth place teams back for additional interviews to discuss their ability to do concrete, and that we put a 6-week deadline on that and ask them to address a condition of their being hired for, or whatever you want to call it. You used a word. Can they meet the construction cycle? I don't know how to say it properly. The other thing that I would add in there is that we ask those, and I don't know if it's appropriate to do that this time or when we come back in 6 weeks, But since the council's already voted for concrete on 2 streets, it would seem to me to make sense to ask for expertise in designs in concrete, not necessarily asphalt, save us money by not doing 2 designs. So that's my motion.
I'm going to second the motion. This is difficult because we have a strong staff recommendation for NCE, but we have a history, and I know the question's been raised, so what didn't you like about NCE? It's a history of causing issues with this process that were problematic with the community. But I guess maybe the good thing is the community got engaged, and because the community got engaged, we, council, got information, and it was very helpful. And then you have staff saying, yes, but the other ones don't know anything about concrete. All of those are problematic, but obviously for this council, those problems are outweighed by our lack of comfort with our history with NCE. Further discussion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I'd like to request, in addition to the motion, if the maker and seconder are willing, I don't really want to throw out NCE yet, since it seems to be head and shoulders better. So I would ask that we add to that, staff do some analysis of the problems that we've had and maybe why it won't happen again, if that's acceptable.
As mayor of the motion, I don't want to add that, given the discussion that we've had about NCE.
And I wouldn't second it. Further discussion. All right, seeing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. And we'll be seeing this project back soon. All right, we're now on agenda item 9. Property location, North 40 Specific Plan Area, Phase 1. And this is to consider approval, a request for approval of an exception to the story pole policy. Before we get there, I have a question of staff. Is the applicant here, is the applicant the town, or is the applicant the developer?
The applicant is the developer.
All right, and so therefore there would be 10 minutes
Yes.
for that. Okay. So before we get to the applicant, do we have a staff report? Thank you. Go ahead.
Good evening. The North 40 specific plan was adopted in June of last year, and staff is in the process of reviewing the architecture and site application and the vesting tentative map applications for Phase 1 of the development. Staff anticipates that these applications will be considered by the Planning Commission and the Town Council in spring or early summer of this year. And Phase 1 includes 320 residential units, including 50 affordable senior units, as well as approximately 66,000 square feet of commercial use area. Phase 1 encompasses the southern half of the specific plan area. And due to the size of the development, as well as the existing uses on the site, the applicant is proposing an exception or several deviations from the full requirements of the story pole policy. I have included them up on the overhead just so that we can walk through them. The applicant is proposing to install, the applicant does have 2 proposals. Their original proposal is attachment 2. They also included a revised story pole plan, which is attachment 3. Attachment 2 looks at providing story poles along the perimeter, as well as the majority of the commercial uses, including the Market Hall and senior housing mixed use building, which is the tallest within the Phase 1 development. And that would comply with the story pole policy requirements for exceptions. Additionally, the applicant is looking to use flag ropes for, in this case, just the Market Hall building. That is the only building in Phase 1 that exceeds 40 feet in height. And due to concerns in regards to high wind for the taller poles. And additionally, they are looking to reduce the time frame for the installation from 4 weeks from the date of the notices being sent for the Planning Commission hearing. Generally, the story poles would be required to stay up through the Planning Commission public hearing process as well as the Town Council public hearing process, and I guess there would be no appeal period since it would be a Town Council decision. The applicant is proposing to provide a scale model of the proposed Phase 1 development, and that would be on display in the Town Council chambers lobby throughout the public hearing process. And the applicant hasn't really spoken to it, but they are open to the usage of balloons, as has been used in previous applications, but hasn't really been well received in the town. But they are throwing that out as an option. Staff does believe that the intent of allowing complex developments such as planned developments to request a exception to the story pole policy is met with the proposed development and the proposed exceptions that the applicant is requesting. Staff is in support of the proposed application, and the findings are provided in the staff report.
Thank you. A couple of questions. It wasn't clear to me what you were saying about the time frame. I got 4 weeks, but I didn't catch what else you were saying.
So the applicant is requesting to only have them installed for 4 weeks from the date that they go out for the Planning Commission public hearing, or the notices go out for the Planning Commission public hearing, which is about 2 weeks before the Planning Commission hearing.
So they would go up 2 weeks before the Planning Commission hearing and come down 2 weeks after the Planning Commission hearing?
Presumably, yes. That is if the Planning Commission only takes one public hearing to discuss it.
And yes, there's an assumption there that the Planning Commission will come to a conclusion of some sort at that one meeting. Or is the proposal that the flags or the netting would stay up for 2 weeks after whatever the Planning Commission does?
The applicant's proposal is just for 4 weeks from the date of the notices.
Just 4 weeks, okay. And then I am familiar with balloons, and I share your perspective on them. I am not familiar with the flags. I mean, I know what the flags are. The pictures that have been provided as the flags do not show up very well. In your experience as a professional, have you seen these flags in use, and do they show up well?
Unfortunately, I have not seen them in use.
Okay, thank you. Other questions of staff? Ms. Sayak?
At what is the site currently occupied by Artisan Wine Depot, aren't those flags that they're using, or is it the netting?
That is the netting.
The netting, okay.
All right, thank you.
Of course.
Just a moment. Ms. Jensen.
I have a similar question. How tall is the top of the netting at the Artisan Wine Depot? Just so I can have in my brain what 40 feet is.
I should know this. I was just working on the report right before coming in here. The townhouse style units, I believe, are just above 30 feet in height.
Thanks. I'm hearing a whisper of 32. Would that be right?
Maybe. I don't know the exact number. It's less than 35. It's more than 30.
Well, there you go. 32 sounds good. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I have a question. In your staff report, you pulled language out of the story pole policy, and if I can quote it here a little bit, it says, the deciding body will take into account the density of the development when considering an exception request. What is density of the development? I don't understand. How do you take it into consideration? What am I considering?
So in looking at, the way I read it is in looking at the ratio of units that they're proposing to provide examples of through story poles versus how much they're proposing. So it's that's what we're talking about when it looks at the density and providing an exception.
So it's not really giving a guidance, it's just saying think about it.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I see no further questions. As the staff pointed out, the applicant is the developer, and so Mr. Capobres, I see you've submitted a card, and your entire team, whoever is going to be speaking, will have a total amount of 10 minutes.
Madam Mayor, council members, I'm Don Capobres, representing the development team for the North 40. I've never really gotten 10 minutes before. Don't know what to do with that time, so I'll be shorter than the 10 minutes, but available to answer any questions. There's been a lot of debate and conversation about the North 40 over the last better part of a decade. The one thing that I have been given clear direction on throughout this time is not to take the story pole policy lightly. So this exception request is submitted with that sensitivity in mind. We essentially, and I want to focus on that second proposal that we have on the screen, and we'll forget the first alternative altogether. Based on conversations with stakeholders throughout town, after we submitted that first letter, we realized we can do better. The areas that we propose or we seek some flexibility on are generally in the interior of the site. They're essentially, from a utility perspective, not going to be seen from the public viewpoints from either the freeway, Lark Avenue, or Los Gatos Boulevard. They generally, where we're seeking some flexibility, are the areas that have some conflict with existing residential or existing business uses, like on the Area A portion, where we're going to have some difficulty with poles because Boulevard Tavern is in operation, Enterprise Rent-A-Car is in operation, Bartlett Tree Company is operation, and there's a lot of trucks and cars moving through those driveways. But for the most part, the entire perimeter will be story-poled. We have over 450 poles proposed on the site. Again, all vantage points from a public perspective are covered, and in the interior of the site, we thought it was important to story pole the tallest building, which is our proposed market hall with our senior affordable housing above it. From a duration perspective, there is some flexibility there. Our story pole consultant gives us advice that the poles can stay up for a total of 60 days without kind of concern that they'll start falling down at that point. So we are flexible to keep those up for 60 days. We would anticipate starting construction on those story poles given council's direction tonight or at a later date. We are excited to, as your story pole policy dictates, to augment our story pole plan by creating a full-scale model, which is going to be 20 feet to an inch scale, which translates into an 8-foot by 8-foot model, which, working with staff, we understand will be displayed here at Town Council chambers outside in the lobby. And we're also excited, as has hopefully been our hallmark over all these years, to continue the transparency of our community outreach process by agreeing in coordination with town staff to a community open house, which will feature that model next week. So we invite folks to come out to see that. I think you'll get a sense of the scale of this first phase proposal, and I think you'll better understand kind of where those buildings are in the interior that are going to be blocked by either existing buildings that are already constructed or proposed buildings on the perimeter. With that, I'm available to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I guess I have several. Maybe I just start real simple. Why do we care if they fall over?
There's 450 poles out there. There's Bennett Way has existing residents on it. There are existing farm operations potentially going on, and there are existing businesses going on the North 40.
That you just covered several of my questions actually in the answer about farm operations and some of the houses. I also would ask, during the time they're up, do you go out on a certain basis and check to make sure they're not about to fall over, since then it sounds like it's dangerous as is, so do you have some regular checking maintenance schedule on them?
We can do that. There's several entities involved. We are in coordination with the Yuki Family Property Management Group, Grosvenor Property Management Group, and some of the other tenants that we have. So we've been coordinating pretty well up to this point, but it seems to reason that we should have a regular maintenance check-in to make sure nothing's falling over.
One more?
Yes.
I don't think you really said why do you not want the poles on the inside? I think you indicated that nobody's going to be able to see them anyway, but is there any good reasons to not have them?
Yeah, if you can see, it's really hard to tell on this overhead, but the bulk of the not poled area is in the center of the site where the bulk of the existing residential homes are. You can kind of see them in the dark outline on that plan.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Kapobris, I was curious about the flag proposal. So I agree with the mayor that in the pictures you provided, it's hard to see the flags. But so I wonder if you have a better depiction of, are they going to be neon orange like netting, or are they going to be something else?
Yeah, the flags are, council member, the flags are proposed to be neon orange as is the mesh. But instead of the mesh going all the way through, they'll be attached to rope, and that's for high wind, impact.
And I'm assuming they would be at increments that make sense so that people can see what the lines are versus like putting them 10 feet apart. So how close would the little flags be?
I don't actually know the answer to that specifically. I'll turn to my partner to see if you know the answer to spacing of the flags. What I can commit to is it 18 inches? We can work with the flagpole consultant on spacing if there is any flexibility on that. I understand the concern.
I just want to make sure that it's a reasonable depiction of what the roof line would look like, because if you space the flags out, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, and it'd probably be a waste of everyone's time if we didn't give that depiction anyway, so I can commit to working with the consultant to make sure that's depicted properly.
Ms. Sayak.
3 questions for you. For the flag rope, following up on that, the request is for only those structures that are over 40 feet. So my understanding, the only structure that's over 40 feet will be the market hall that has the senior housing over it.
That's correct,
Is there more?
No.
And that would be area on your map here, that area?
Right above Area B.
Right
Vice
above
Mayor.
Area B. Okay. The second question I had about the 4 weeks, you mentioned you had some flexibility that can go up to 60 days. But as you heard the mayor said, that's an assumption that the Planning Commission will be deciding within one meeting. Is that 60 days for the Planning Commission and then 60 days for council? What is it that you're looking at in terms of timing?
Yeah, we would. So the timing is, it's presumptuous either way that we go, and I understand that there's some risk to that. But presuming that we're hopeful to go to Planning Commission sometime in March, we would start. This is going to take quite a bit of time to construct. We would start constructing the story poles to meet the 10-day before hearing timeframe and probably exceed that. And then from the time they're installed, we would propose, based on our consultant's recommendation, keeping them up for 60 days.
Totality.
In total.
And final question. So the interior, I want to talk about the interior. I mean, you are story pulling quite a bit. And the conflicts with existing residents and the farm operations, I completely get that. It's hard for me to tell, though, the areas that you are not placing story poles on, for example, adjacent to First Street, that doesn't look like it's adjacent to an existing home. And so could you at least, on your map, highlight what other areas will not be story poled just because, in your opinion, they can't be seen? Okay, and so within that, you have the dark lines which represent.
Hold on, I don't want to speak.
Okay.
So from a view corridor perspective, there are some very tall is a relative term, taller buildings already built on Los Gatos Boulevard. The bulk of those interior buildings will not be seen. And then from the Highway 17 perspective, we are story polling every building on the perimeter there, and then as well as on Lark.
If I could rephrase my question. I understand it's your opinion but my concern is until we see the story polls, we can't verify that you can't see from 17, from Los Gatos Boulevard, and other vantage points. So of the pink area you just highlighted, I understand that you have some existing residences there that you're trying to protect. But are there other areas that do not have conflict with existing residences that you can still story poll? And where I'm going with this is if we're going to continue the discussion of transparency, I think it's best to have the community verify that the interior can't be seen rather than take your word for it.
Well, again, I think it's this area here, this area here, this area here, that are not impacted by existing units.
Okay, and then so I understand where that is. And so realistically, how many more polls approximate?
32. Oh yeah, for the articulation, maybe 75 more polls.
Okay, thank you.
Let me jump in here. You made 3 boxes. You just made 3 boxes, and you sort of made them with darker lines. Could you do a different color or something? And what are those? I'm going to call those the brown boxes. What are the brown boxes?
Those are areas we propose not to story poll because they would be obstructed by either existing buildings or the other story poles that are being constructed, and they are not impacted by existing uses, other than farm operations.
Thank you. Ms. Jensen.
I am assuming that there is no public access to the interior of the property.
It's
correct?
That's correct.
So I'm only going to be seeing any story pole based on me driving or walking by on the public streets, correct?
Yes.
Thanks.
Other questions? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. So the box on the left, we'll call them the brown boxes on the left, how does the height of that compare? It looks, when I look like we got 2 buildings in front of it. Is that correct? And I think we're stepping up height, so it's probably 25 feet in the first building on the left, and then the next one is 35, and then this box, the brown box, so that's probably 35. And how much is the brown box?
35 as well.
Okay. And one more question, if I could. So to the flag, on the story pole flag issue on the over 40 feet, part of it seemed like, we talked about how the gap on the flags, but the flag's sort of small also. I'm wondering, the pictures, again, doesn't show very much. Could we double rope? So now the wind's not going to make any difference, right? You got one above, and then you put another one 4 feet below or 3 feet below, and that's kind of what you got anyway with the current orange webbing anyway. So if we had 2 ropes of flags, maybe that would sort of be more closer to.
Councilmember, out of my expertise on the rope flag issue, we can have that conversation with the consultant. I know the understanding is just creating the visibility and making sure if we go through the trouble of putting the story poles up there that they tell the story, to use a headliner writer's headline, that they tell the whole story, and but also balancing kind of the safety issues with the high wind. So we should have probably had the consultant here to speak to that. I don't think anyone in the room is expert on that, but I understand the issue at hand.
Thank you.
Other questions of Mr. Capobres? Seeing none, thank you, sir. If you want to speak to this item, please submit a card. I do have a card. Dale Miller.
Sorry,
Marnie. Dale Miller, 115 Newell Court. I want to agree with the council that story poles are important. I don't want to see, like Netflix, where they had a forklift with a little bitty panel 40-something feet in the air that didn't really depict the mass of the buildings. I don't think the people in the area really had a good feel for how big the Netflix buildings were really going to be. I would recommend, even if these buildings are hidden and there's people living in them, that will at least outline the four corners of the major building and approximate the height with continued flags, so people get a chance to, if they can see it from Lark or wherever they're looking from, to get an idea of the mass of what the actual buildings are going to look like from the outside perimeter footprint. They don't have to be detailed, but at least it's the square they're going to take over and the height with additional flags. So that instead of letting the 2 in the middle go away, or the 3, whatever the number is, there needs to be some story pole. And I think the other 2 elephants in this discussion that have not really been settled is the traffic. Lark and Winchester. If you've been in Lark and Winchester lately, it's a joke. And we haven't even finished up the second 2 Netflix buildings. And Roku has now moved into half of the old Netflix building. Between 5 and 7 at night, southbound on Winchester is a safety hazard. And the other piece that's not been discussed and identified is schools. It may be targeted to seniors, but you know that as well as everybody else that people are trying to get in Los Gatos schools. There has to be an answer for what's going to happen with the schools with these additional houses, because it may not be seniors, it may be single families that have kids and eventually want to go. So those are the 2 elephants in the room that also need to be identified. Thank you.
Mr. Miller, hold on just a minute. If you would put back the pink and brown graphic. Now, you were saying that you would like more.
So the area that's hatched in the middle, if they can just outline the mass of the building. So if there's 4 corner poles and it's going to be 35 feet or whatever, put 4, as long as it doesn't impact a house, put 4 poles up that would at least show everybody what's in the center and what the mass is. It doesn't have to be details, but at least the highest part's going to be whatever the height is. The outside is going to be 100 by 50, or whatever the number is. So
all right.
If it's 8 poles here, 4, 4, 4, 4. So at least people have an idea of what that is going to be. And if they can't see it, they can't see it. It can't be that hard to do. These guys are civil engineers. They should be able to figure it out.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jason Farwell.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. Thanks for this opportunity. I would just echo the last speaker's comments. This is really, I think, one of the most monumental projects ever to come before our town. And you can see this property from a lot of different vantages, particularly on Highway 17. It's fairly obvious, and I want to see the scale. I want to see the mass. I want to see the density. The orange netting, I think, is incredibly important. These ropes, I agree with you folks up there. The pictures just really leave me wanting more from a visual impact standpoint. I don't think that this orange netting is going to create an additional hazard. I don't see any support for that position. The fire department was mentioned, or the fire marshal was mentioned in one of the letters as a potential source for at least opining on that particular issue. There's no supporting documentation for that. This thing needs to go up. It needs to be mapped out. I completely agree about the center piece there, about getting story poles up there so that we can see what's going on in the interior. People have no idea what's going on out of the North 40. They have no idea. They will when they see this. They will. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Hirschman.
Thank you. I'm Bill Hirschman. To answer, Mr. Rennie, one of your questions, I am impacted by this area as well as this area. As you well know, we own the office building that's adjacent to that. There are houses all along this area. These poles fall down. I mean, it's just a reality. It's one good El Nino storm away from losing a portion of them. It may not be all of them, but they do fall. And I think the intent with the poles is always to give an indication of the mass, if you will, and the height, more importantly, I think, of projects. And they certainly are providing that. The previous speaker just talked about the view from Highway 17. Well, if the buildings are clearly marked on Highway 17 and the interior of the project isn't any higher than that, you frankly won't see it. I mean, you'll see the poles that are along 17 or along Lark, but you won't even see the interior of this because it will be blocked, obviously, by the heights. The other thing that you have here is that the existing buildings that we have along the frontage here are you couldn't ask for a better view of what a height of that caliber will be. It exists. I mean, they couldn't put up enough story poles to give you a better concept of what those heights and those masses would be. Right, wrong, like it or don't like it, it exists. And it's, I'm going to give you a rough guess that I think the building is 35 feet, and if you add the screening on the top, it's very close to 40 feet. So it gives you a really good indication of what the views are along the Los Gatos corridor of that type of height. I would also add that, I don't want to pull the how many children must die argument, but there are children and families that live along that road. And I would hate to be impacted, as well as our parking lot. So I would hate to be impacted by that. But that's not a great argument if you can't, well, it's a great argument not to kill children, don't get me wrong. But it's the heights will be determined. It will be fairly easy to be able to see the view of what those heights look like. They're providing enough of that. The only thing I can say, having had lots of experience in this, the model, I will tell you, will be the most significant example of what you can. I've done many of these projects, done very sensitive sites like this, and there is nothing better than the model to give you an indication of how that site will be massed and what the viewpoints of that will be. And they are deadly accurate. I mean, I know from many experiences. So that's a very positive for the council to have the developer being provided for that. Thank you.
Questions of Mr. Hirschman? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Last card, Lee Fago.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. Lee Fago, Lilac Way, Los Gatos. Interesting, we were talking about putting up story poles, but I think we need to also concern ourselves with poles that are already up on the CVS property on Los Gatos Boulevard, which is the former Chevy dealership. Those poles are dangerous. Someone needs to manage that and make sure they're down, since they're not serving a purpose any longer. The design, I believe, has changed based on going to some planning commission meetings. The poles that are there now are flimsy. They're flapping around. They need to be removed. Someone needs to manage that. Shifting gears, Netflix. We have no idea what they're doing over there. Never had any privy to what was happening, other than, as was mentioned earlier, the forklift that raised something. But I think Reed Hastings may be the only person who knows what's really happening on that property today. The new building on the story poles that just went up in the last week on Los Gatos Boulevard and Shannon Road has been very telling, and I salute the fact that they also put up some images of what the new construction is going to look like. It's not just the story poles, but there are renderings of what the new buildings are going to look like. And I think the model that is being proposed is also a great idea. It was interesting today, in 10 minutes being on Los Gatos Boulevard, I went to look at those story poles. 9 people walked up, some intentionally, to a couple that were just people casually walking, specifically to look at those story poles. They were completely unaware, and their neighbors. One couple was just coming back from a trip and had no clue that any construction was going to be happening there, and they were pretty frightened, is the word I'd use, how they described what they saw by those story poles. Story poles serve a purpose. The North 40 is the largest single project, I believe, in the history of Los Gatos, and having the story poles up to be able to get some concept of what the visibility is going to be from people who are traveling in that area to the mountains, to that property, onto that property, from 85, 17, Lark, and Los Gatos Boulevard. This is going to be significant. Having the story poles there will tell a story. So I propose that you consider going forward with having the story poles there for all of us to be able to see over a long enough period of time to digest it, take action, and comment back to you. So thank you.
Thank you. Questions of Mr. Pagel? Scene.
If I may, I have 3 seconds left. We could also send drones over there. I'm saying that a little jokingly, but
Ha ha.
yes.
All right. Lee Quintana?
I really wanted to speak after, so I could just say I agree with somebody or I didn't agree with somebody. But since you called me first, I'll have to make my comments. I think I forgot to say Lee Quintana. I think given the fact of the model that's being prepared or are proposed, given the number of story poles that are being that are proposed around the periphery, given what Mr. Hirschman said about the height of his buildings, and given the fact that in comparison to the Netflix project, this will be very visible, which the exceptions granted to the Netflix project were produced something that was not very visible and produced reaction from the residents and public around, which then resulted in the not very effective cranes. I think if what is being proposed here is not effective to tell the story, you're going to hear about it from the public. And I think that what is being proposed is sufficient to tell the story. Thank you.
Thank you. Last card. Before the applicant comes back, Maria Risto.
Hi, Maria Risto. Initially, well, first of all, I'd have to say that one of the most important things that the town did was adopt a story pole policy, because people really don't know what's going on until they see the story poles. And for this project, it's easy to forget that there's residents who don't know what's going to happen in Phase 1. It's easy to forget that there's residents who don't know there's something being developed at the North 40. And it's easy to forget that there's people in town who actually don't even know that there is a North 40. So when the story poles go up, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people going, oh my God, what is that? So to that effect, it's important that we have the story poles up. When I looked at the exceptions, because my concern is we've had a variety of exceptions, and some of them that have been granted have been very good. St. Mary's was allowed to have their story poles up at a different time because of interfering with schools. Netflix had an exception because of the height, and we had the cherry pickers. I think that was completely ineffective. So it is concerning to make sure that we know what we're seeing. In this case, I think the scale model will really flesh out and illuminate what we're seeing, because the story poles kind of tell the height, but they don't really tell what you're seeing. And in a project like this, where there are so many buildings, I know that when I'm standing on Lark Avenue or on Los Gatos Boulevard and staring at it, what I'll see is the first buildings and maybe something a little higher, but it'll be impossible to look through those poles and see the depth of everything. So I'm really grateful that there's going to be a scale model where I can then take what I'm seeing and then look down and sort of project it. I think just a scale model never would have worked to tell the story. I had a little bit of concern about whether the flag rope is going to be visible enough for the tall building, but it sounds like there's options, doubling it up or having the spacing be close together. So I don't know if there's some kind of specification that can be given that it be as visible from a quarter mile away as mesh or something. I don't know how that can be done, but just make sure that can be seen. I can understand the mesh would be an issue. And then I just think it would be an absolute, it doesn't matter, but it might be a huge waste of time to story pole the interior. None of us can walk in there and see it. So since we can't walk through and see what everything looks like, we'll be staring at it through the other poles. So that's where I think the scale model makes sense. The 60 days, I look at all of the story poles that keep falling down around town. I think one of the things we need to add to our story pole policy is what happens after a certain amount of time. CVS, those poles should just come down, and they should go back up when a new project or a revised project comes up, because it's just a wreck. It looks horrible. That's all. Thanks.
Questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you. I have no other cards, and so I will call the applicant up, and the applicant's team has 5 minutes if they wish.
Madam Mayor, I'm not sure I can add anything to what's already been stated. So on the flag rope, obviously, we'll be working with our consultant to try to make that more visible or as visible as we can without jeopardizing any life safety issues. I wish we were a little bit more prepared to answer that question. But other than that, I'm here to answer any other questions you might have.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Mr. Cabrobre, can't quite say your name.
Don's
Sorry.
fine.
Don, Mr. Don. The center section, a couple speakers questioned putting poles in there to see the on the corners or something to see the size and the mass of that. Seems like a good idea, but when I look at that, I'm not sure that's one building. Is that one building? The non-brown hashed portion in the middle? Is that four buildings or one building?
Those are multiple buildings.
So just putting poles at the corner of it doesn't tell us very much then, right?
No, and because of kind of how the mesh has to be supported, you can't, with the runs that we have, it's difficult to do the four corners of the building. We would have to do multiple, for spacing, we'd have to do multiple poles as well.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Close the public testimony portion of this public hearing and look to the council for questions, motion, discussion. While everybody else is pondering their motions, because I know that's what they're getting ready to do, I have always thought that I agree with whoever said it, the story pole policy that Los Gatos developed some years ago is great. And we may have lived with the North 40, it seems like, forever, but there will be people who do not know that there is a project there until they see that orange netting. And then they're probably going to be running to the council and saying, why did you do X, Y, and Z? And I agree, I think it was Mr. Farwell, people are going to be very probably surprised. So I think it's a good way to inform people about what's going on. Models are fine. There were several people here who thought the models were fine and the rendering was very helpful. To me, they're much more secondary. I think that once you see all the orange netting, then seeing what the buildings actually look like will be helpful to your curiosity. But as far as advising the population of this town that something is happening there and the size of it, this orange netting, and I'm waiting for the motion that's going to fill in the gaps about how specifically we're going to do this orange netting. So I think that I have talked enough so that everybody else is ready to make a motion. Ms. Jensen.
Okay. So my motion is that we require the developer to put the story poles as are depicted on the overhead that's there, which is also attachment 3 of our staff report, to include all of the properties that are indicated there. I don't think that my motion is not going to include putting 4 corners in the interior, because I do believe that it's going to be hard to see that from where people are actually going to be allowed to go. So I still think that this netting is going to do its job to alert people to what is going on there, and then hopefully their curiosity will be piqued so that they will come and investigate that by looking at the model. So require the story poles as depicted in attachment 3, allow the flag that is proposed only for the 40-foot building, not for any other building, and that it be double roped and that the flags be spaced to indicate, so that there's a clear indication of the roof line. And I think that someone suggested that it should be as visible as netting would be, and I don't know what that is because I'm not a consultant, but I think that's clear from the motion that what we want to do is duplicate the effect of the netting without actually having a net there. My motion would include having a reduced installation period. Our staff report says 4 weeks. I think 60 days is appropriate. And to the extent that that 60 days can sandwich as much as possible whatever public hearings are happening, do that. Mr. Kapober said that he was open to having a maintenance person. I would like to include that as part of the motion. And part of the motion would be to display a scale model for the proposed development throughout the public hearing process. So that's regardless of the 60 days, that model be available. And if the lobby out here is the best place, okay. Sometimes people can't find, just like they'll wake up in the morning and say, are you doing something to the North 40? They'll also wake up and go, where's the town hall? So if we can figure out maybe to put it in by the library or somewhere where everybody is going, where it's not going to intrude on the use of the library, that would be a really nice thing. So I'd like to have some flexibility. Maybe it's a moving display. Maybe like 1 week it's here and the next week like a Broadway show. But that it be throughout the process. And that there be appropriate signage, photographs, depictions, etc., that need to take place on the property, and that include information that a scale model is available for viewing, so that on the sign that says what the project is, if there needs to be something that says, for additional information, there's a scale model available for you to look at, inquire here, so that they know that there is a secondary place to look. So that's my motion.
All right, thank you. I'm going to second it after if I get some clarification. With regard to attachment 3, there were 3 areas that we've been calling the brown areas. Is that included in your motion?
No. Those were areas that were not going to be included in the polling per attachment 3 and per the proposal because of housing, farm operations, etc. There's only the brown areas were not affected by that, but my motion doesn't include them because just based on the information that we have and my other experience with story polls is that I don't know that those are going to add to anything. I don't think that people are going to see them through the other perimeter poles.
All right, and then with regard to the orange flags, would you add to your motion that they be as large and as close together as possible?
Sure.
Now, you also had a reduction in the installation for 60 days. How does that relate to the timing of Planning Commission hearing or hearings and Town Council hearing or hearings?
I believe that I said that I wanted that 60 days to be sandwiched as much as possible around the Planning Commission hearings. I haven't even considered, and maybe did not include it in the motion, anything with respect to potential Town Council hearings, because who knows? The developer doesn't want to hear this, the applicant doesn't want to hear this. By the time it gets to the Town Council, they may be falling down and we need to start over again anyway.
All right, so this motion it sandwiches or encompasses the Planning Commission meeting, but doesn't speak to one way or the other a Town Council meeting.
It does not, however, it did include the model be available throughout any and all hearings.
All right. Well, after all that work, I got the motion. I'm not going to second it because I wanted netting or some kind of demarcation on the brown squares that were put up on the overhead. So we have a motion. I think we all understand the motion. Do we have a second? Mr. Rennie.
I think the motion was actually quite thorough, so I'll go ahead and second it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Do we have discussion? Ms. Sayak.
I'm in agreement with almost every aspect of the motion, except for the brown boxes that were just created tonight. You know, I understand that there's a logic in that no one will be able to see it, but what I'd like is the ability for everyone who's viewing it to make that decision for themselves. And I feel that if we just take away that ability, it just starts off the entire process not in as transparent a way as I'd like us to move forward in. So I would like the brown boxes included.
Okay, for the sake of trying to get hopefully a consensus on the council, I personally don't think that they're going to make that much of a difference, but if it's the difference between support for the motion and not, then fine, I'll include them.
All right, so you're including netting on the brown, what we call the brown boxes. Mr. Rennie?
That's acceptable.
All right, further discussion? Seeing none, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, council, staff, and residents. Meeting's adjourned.